Marcus Varela straightened his cufflinks and smiled at the photographer like a man who had already won. His hand rested on Celeste Raymond's waist with the casual ownership of someone marking territory. And when his eyes found Alina across the ballroom, his ex-wife, the woman he had spent 18 months trying to erase from his own guilt, that smile didn't waver. It sharpened. He wanted her to see this. He had arranged it. The invitation sent to her address was not an accident. It was a message dressed in expensive paper. Look what you walked away from. Look what replaced you. He had no idea the man standing quietly beside her was about to dismantle everything he thought he owned. If this kind of story hits somewhere real for you, the kind where justice arrives quietly and without warning, subscribe to this channel right now and follow every chapter to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us which city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what's coming next. The charity gala for the Manhattan Arts Foundation had been running for 11 years, and in all that time, the ballroom of the Ashford Hotel had never looked quite like this, chandeliers throwing honeyed light across 500 people who were all, in their own way, performing some version of themselves. Architects and gallery owners, tech investors who flew private and told nobody, socialites who treated philanthropy as brand extension. The bar was scotch and sparkling water. The canapes were things Alina couldn't name, and the dress code was black tie with an unspoken addendum, arrive with something to prove. Alina Marquez had not arrived with anything to prove. That was the thing Marcus would never understand about her, not then, not now, not standing 40 feet away with his new fiancée, draped on his arm like a statement piece. Alina had come tonight because her friend Diana had begged her for 3 weeks straight, because the foundation supported youth architecture programs that actually mattered, and because it was December in New York and she had spent too many evenings alone in her apartment, watching the snow settle on the fire escape and calling it peace when it was actually just the absence of noise. She needed to be somewhere real tonight. She had not expected Marcus to be here. She should have. In hindsight, she should have. He ran in these circles, or rather, he had spent 7 years of their marriage aggressively purchasing entry into these circles, buying tables at galas, donating the minimum required to get his name on plaques, shaking hands with men whose last names appeared on buildings. Marcus Varela had a gift for proximity to power, for standing close enough to important people that some of their gravity transferred to him by association. She had watched him do it for years before she understood that she had been part of the same strategy. She had been the respectable wife, the accomplished architect with the quiet reputation, the woman whose caliber made him look serious. When she left, he lost that too. She understood that now. She hadn't when she was inside it. Ronan Vale stood beside her with a glass of sparkling water he hadn't touched, wearing a suit that fit him the way suits fit men who don't particularly care about suits correctly, but without performance. He was 41, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that made certain people in rooms like this visibly uncomfortable. There was a scar along his left jaw that he had stopped explaining years ago. His hair was dark and cut short and not styled in any deliberate way. He looked like a man who had been somewhere difficult and come back from it, which was accurate. "You went quiet," he said, without looking at her. "I'm always quiet." Different quiet, he glanced sideways. His eyes moved across the room with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned to read environments before entering them, not paranoia, just habit. The kind built by years of situations where reading the room correctly was the difference between bad outcomes and worse ones. "Someone you know?" Alina picked up her champagne glass, held it without drinking. "My ex-husband just walked in." A pause. Not discomfort. Ronan rarely showed discomfort, more like he was filing the information somewhere useful. The one who, yes, he nodded once, said nothing else. That was one of the things about him she had taken months to stop finding unnerving and start finding steadying. He didn't fill silence with reassurance. He didn't say it's fine, or don't let him ruin your night, or any of the reflexive comfort words people reached for when they didn't know what else to do. He just stayed where he was, solid, present, not leaving. She had been with men who filled every silence. She knew now that they did it because they couldn't tolerate the silence itself, not because they were trying to help her. Marcus was moving through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this entrance, Celeste Raymond on his arm, her gold dress catching light from 3 different chandeliers. Celeste was 28, luminously beautiful in the way that seemed almost engineered, the daughter of Gerald Raymond, whose real estate empire had been expanding into financial services for the past 4 years. Marcus had done well for himself in the year since the divorce. Strategically well. The engagement to Celeste wasn't just romantic, it was a merger, and everyone in this room understood that without anyone having to say it. He saw Alina at the 17-minute mark. She knew the exact moment because she was watching for it. The way you watch for a car you know is going to run a red light, not hoping to be wrong, just preparing to not be surprised. His gaze swept the room, snagged on her, and for a fraction of a second, something crossed his face that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite relief and was exactly what she'd expected. The expression of a man who had sent an invitation to a specific address and needed confirmation that it had worked. It had worked. She was here. What he hadn't planned for was Ronan. Marcus's eyes moved from Alina to the man beside her and stopped moving. The expression recalibrated. Not fear, Marcus was too controlled for visible fear, but something shifting beneath the surface, a reassessment happening in real time. Ronan was not the kind of man you dismissed easily. He was not polished the way the men in this room were polished. He was something else, something that didn't resolve neatly into any of the categories. Marcus used to people into threats and non-threats, and Alina could see him working on it from across the room. "He's looking at you," she said quietly. "I know." Ronan took a small sip of his water. "Is he the kind of man who comes over or the kind who waits and makes you come to him?" "He comes over. He always comes over. He can't stand not controlling the approach. Then we wait." They waited 6 minutes. Alina knew because the string quartet changed pieces twice. When Marcus finally crossed the room toward them, Celeste on his arm, he had assembled the full performance, the warm smile, the extended hand, the generosity of a man being gracious toward his past. He was good at this. She had to give him that. He was genuinely gifted at appearing to be something he wasn't. Alina. He said it like they were old friends who had simply lost touch. Not like a man who had spent the last year of their marriage making her feel like her own perceptions couldn't be trusted. "You look wonderful. I'm glad you could make it." She shook his hand because not shaking it would have given him something to perform hurt about. "Marcus, congratulations on the engagement." "Thank you." He turned to Celeste with the practiced warmth of a man who knew he was being watched. "Sweetheart, this is Alina. We were married, God, was it 7 years?" 8, Alina said. 8 years. He shook his head like it was something gentle to reflect on. Then he looked at Ronan with the expression of a man who had decided to be magnanimous. "And you are?" Ronan looked at him. He had a way of making eye contact that wasn't aggressive and wasn't deferential and contained no performance whatsoever, which was deeply disorienting for men who were accustomed to reading status in the first 3 seconds of an interaction. Ronan Vale, he offered his hand. Marcus took it. The handshake lasted a normal amount of time. No dominance games, no crushing grip. Ronan had nothing to prove through handshakes. "Are you in the arts, Ronan?" Marcus asked. The question was calibrated friendly on the surface, but specific. "What are you doing here? What table are you at? Do you belong in this room?" "Technology investment. Mostly." "Interesting." Marcus nodded in the way people nod when they're dismissing information. "Startup space?" "Some." "Infrastructure primarily." The word infrastructure landed, and Marcus filed it somewhere in the non-threatening category, because infrastructure was boring and not glamorous and didn't suggest the kind of money that posed any real competition to what he was building with the Raymond family alliance. Alina watched him make the decision in real time, watched him reclassify Ronan as background. That would matter later. She didn't know how much yet. "Well," Marcus said, turning his attention back to Alina with the particular intimacy of a man reclaiming something he considered his, "It's good to see you doing well. Truly." The word truly was doing a lot of work. It implied that he had been worried, that he had thought about her, that his concern for her was benevolent and ongoing. "You've been working? The studio?" "The studio is doing very well, thank you." "Good. Good." He put his hand briefly on her arm, just the forearm, just for a second, nothing anyone watching could reasonably call inappropriate, and she felt the old reflex of her body cataloging the gesture, measuring it, preparing a response. She breathed through it. "You always were the most talented person in any room." It sounded like a compliment. In the architecture of Marcus's manipulation, it was a reminder, you are talented, and I recognized it, and I was generous enough to tell you so. It was the opening move in a particular game she had spent 18 months in therapy learning to name. She didn't take the move. "Congratulations again," she said. "Enjoy the evening." He hesitated. He hadn't expected to be dismissed. The conversation wasn't finished on his terms, and then Celeste said something quietly to him, and they moved on, back into the crowd, and Alina let out a breath she had not been aware of holding. Ronan was watching the string quartet. "That's him," she said. "Not a question." "That's him," he paused. "You handled that well." "I've had practice." "Different kind of practice." He looked at her sideways. Something in his expression was careful, not pitying, which she would have hated, but careful in the way of a person who understood that some things required care. "You all right? Ask me in an hour." "Fair enough." The hour passed. Then another. The evening unfolded the way these evenings did: speeches, wine, the pleasant performance of people who cared deeply about causes that also happened to make them look good. Alina found her rhythm again. Diana found her near the bar and talked for 20 minutes about a commission she was pursuing in the Hudson Valley. And Alina felt herself return to herself, the version of herself that had interests and projects and existed independent of the story Marcus Varela had once tried to make her the supporting character of. Ronan drifted, that was the word for it, drifted through the room with the easy invisibility of a man who had never needed to be noticed. He spoke when spoken to. He didn't network in any obvious way. At one point, she saw him in what looked like a quiet conversation with an older man near the window, both of them looking out at the city rather than at each other. The way men sometimes talked when they'd been trained by experience to be sideways about the things that mattered. She was on her second glass of champagne when Marcus found her alone near the edge of the ballroom, Diana having disappeared toward the auction tables. He came without Celeste this time. That was the tell. That was the thing she had learned to read when Marcus shed the witness, when he engineered the private conversation. It meant something was about to be said that he couldn't afford to have overheard. "She's beautiful," Alina said before he could open, naming the thing he was building toward, taking the approach away from him. "Celeste. She seems—" "Don't do that," he said quietly. The social warmth had stepped down a register. This was closer to the real voice, the one she had spent 8 years learning the weight of. "You don't have to perform for me. There's nobody watching." "I'm not performing. You've been performing all night." The independent woman. The new man. He stopped, recalibrated. The smile returned, softer this time, the one he used when he wanted to seem vulnerable. "I miss you, Alina. Is that so hard to believe?" She looked at him. The ballroom hummed behind them. Somewhere across the room, a small laugh went up from a cluster of people near the bar. "What do you want, Marcus?" "I want—" He moved a half step closer, and she didn't move back, because moving back was the thing he was waiting for, the proof that she still carried him as a threat in her body. "I want to know that you're okay. I want to know that this guy, whoever he is actually good for you. That you're not just with him to make a point." "I'm not with him to make a point." "Then what is he?" "Really, he barely speaks. He's wearing a suit that costs maybe $800, which in a room like this means he doesn't care about rooms like this." Marcus's jaw shifted, barely visible, but she had spent 8 years reading that jaw. "You always romanticized detachment, like being checked out of the world was some kind of virtue instead of mindless." "I'm not doing this, Alina. I'm not doing this tonight." She set her champagne glass down on a passing tray with more precision than she felt. "You sent me that invitation. I don't know what you expected to happen when I came, but whatever it was, it isn't happening. I'm here for the foundation. I'm here with someone I care about, and I'm not here to relitigate anything with you." "You really think this guy can give you what I couldn't?" His voice dropped. The question was meant to land a certain way, half genuine, half performance, the kind of question that sounded vulnerable, but was actually designed to make her justify herself, to make her defend her own choices against his standard. She heard it for exactly what it was. "He already has," she said. The words came out quiet and even and completely without aggression, which was what made them land the way they did. Not a weapon, just a fact. A door closed gently but closed completely. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not the hurt he would have wanted her to see, not the easy performance of wounded dignity, but something older and less pretty than that. The expression of a man who had spent a year building a counter-narrative and had just encountered data that didn't fit. "Alina, good night, Marcus. Congratulations on your engagement." She walked away. She didn't look back. She found Ronan at the edge of the room near the tall windows. The city spread behind the glass in its endless winter glitter. He was looking out at it with the expression of a man who could appreciate a thing without needing to own it, which he had come to understand was a rare quality in men who had money. He had money. She had learned that gradually, not because he announced it, but because it became apparent in the quiet ways the address in Tribeca that he owned outright, the way certain calls were answered immediately by people who clearly considered him important, the offhand references to meetings in places she later realized were the boardrooms of companies she recognized. He didn't talk about it. She had asked him once why he didn't talk about it. Because it's not the most interesting thing about me, he'd said. She had almost laughed. Then she'd realized he was serious. Then she had thought about it for several days. He came to find you, Ronan said, without turning. Not a question. Yes. What did he want? She stood beside him at the window, their reflections ghosted in the glass against the city lights behind. She looked strange to herself, or not strange exactly, but different. Less defensive than she expected to look. He wanted me to feel like I still owe him an explanation, like I'm still navigating around him. And I don't. She let that settle for a moment. He asked if you could give me what he couldn't. Ronan was quiet for a beat, then dry as winter pavement. What did you say? I said you already had. He turned his head and looked at her. There was something in his expression she had seen before, but hadn't quite named, something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief, but was in the same family as both. A man who had spent a long time not being chosen by things that mattered to him, recognizing something unusual. That was a good answer, he said. I know. He went back to looking at the city. She stood beside him. The string quartet had switched to something slower. The room went on performing behind them. I need to tell you something, she said. Okay, I almost didn't come tonight. Not because of him. Because she stopped. Started again. I've been careful about rooms like this since the divorce. About anything that feels like his world, his circles. Like I was trying to avoid contamination. Like if I stayed away long enough, his version of who I was would just dissolve. Has it almost. She paused. Tonight helped. He nodded. Then after a moment, the man near the window. Earlier. You saw me talking to him? I noticed. He's on the board of a children's literacy foundation in the Bronx. 300 kids, under-resourced. Building they're in is falling apart. He's been trying to find someone to fund a renovation for 8 months. He paused. I told him I'd have my office call him Monday. She looked at him sideways. You didn't tell me that, to make yourself look good. No. Then why? He considered the question like it deserved consideration. Because you said tonight helped. I wanted you to know this is why I come to rooms I don't particularly enjoy. Not the champagne. Not the politics, he glanced at her. Sometimes the thing that matters is in the corner. Having a quiet conversation nobody's watching. She thought about Marcus's face when she'd walked away. The recalculation happening behind his eyes. The faint, dawning comprehension that he had arranged this evening as a performance for an audience that was no longer interested in his show. He's going to be insufferable at his engagement party, she said. Probably. He'll do something dramatic. Almost certainly. We'll survive it. Ronan said nothing for a moment. Then, simply, yes. The city moved below them, indifferent and luminous, 11 million people running their own private calculations about what they owed the past and what the future might owe them back. The champagne glasses clinked behind them. The chandeliers held their light. For the first time in a long time, Elena Marquez stood in a room that had been meant to diminish her and felt, instead, entirely herself. Not because she had won anything, not because she had beaten Marcus at his own game, but because she had simply stayed present, stayed grounded, stayed with the quiet man beside her, who had not once in the entire evening tried to perform on her behalf. She didn't need saving. She never had. But it was something, she thought it was genuinely something to be standing beside someone who knew that, and stayed anyway. The quartet played on. Marcus Varela, somewhere behind her in the glittering room, laughed at something too loudly, the way men laugh when they are trying to prove they are not watching someone else. Celeste smiled beside him, perfectly composed, her gold dress catching the last of the chandelier light. And Elena Marquez looked out at New York City in December, and felt, settling somewhere in her chest like the first warmth after a very long cold, something she hadn't trusted herself to name in over a year. She decided to let it stay. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, which was already the wrong kind of day. Alina had been at her drafting table since 6 in the morning, working through the third revision of a mixed-use proposal for a site in Long Island City that kept refusing to resolve itself into something she was proud of. The building wanted to be two things at once, and she hadn't figured out yet how to let it be both without the design collapsing into compromise. Coffee had gone cold twice. The city outside her studio window was the color of old pewter, clouds sitting low over the skyline. And the morning had that particular quality of winter Tuesdays in New York, where time moves at three-quarters speed and everything feels slightly unfinished. Her assistant, Priya, brought the envelope in with the rest of the mail and set it on the corner of the drafting table without comment, because Priya had worked with her long enough to know that interrupting a revision spiral required either a genuine emergency or very good pastry, and she had neither. Alina noticed the return address 40 minutes later when she finally surfaced for fresh coffee. The Ashford Hotel. The same address that had hosted the Arts Foundation Gala 3 weeks ago. Same building, different event. She already knew what it was before she opened it. She opened it anyway, the way you press a bruise not to enjoy it, but to confirm it's still there. The card was heavy cream stock, engraved rather than printed, the kind of invitation that communicated through material before you'd read a single word. Marcus Varela and Celeste Raymond request the pleasure of your company at a celebration of their engagement. Date, time, dress code. A handwritten note at the bottom in Marcus's precise, controlled penmanship, the handwriting of a man who had practiced looking confident on paper. I hope you'll come. I mean that. She stood in her kitchen holding the card for a long moment. The coffee maker finished its cycle. Steam rose from the carafe. She put the card face down on the counter and went back to her drafting table. She did not throw it away. That bothered her more than the invitation itself. She called Diana that evening, standing at her apartment window with a glass of red wine she'd poured, and then mostly forgotten about, watching the street below, where a man was trying to convince a large, uncooperative dog to stop investigating a fire hydrant with extreme thoroughness. He invited you, Diana said. Not a question. Diana had a gift for immediate comprehension that occasionally felt like being read by someone who hadn't asked permission. To the engagement party. To the engagement party. At the Ashford. At the Ashford, same venue. I think he booked it specifically to, I don't know, complete a circle or something. Make a statement. The statement being, look how much better I'm doing. Yes, that one. Diana was quiet for a moment. Alina could hear her moving around her kitchen in Park Slope, the particular acoustic of that apartment, high ceilings, original floors that complained under foot traffic. Are you going to go? I don't know. Do you want to go? That's a different question. It's the relevant question. Alina watched the dog below finally commit to the hydrant investigation with full conviction, dragging its owner 3 feet to the left in the process. Part of me wants to go because I don't want him to think I'm afraid of it, which I know is not a good reason. It's a very human reason. And part of me wants to burn the invitation and spend that night eating Thai food and rewatching something I've already seen. She paused. Ronan said something about it. You told him already? He noticed I was off when he came over last night. He asked. She shifted the wine glass to her other hand. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that I don't owe my past anything. That I should only go if I want to close that door. Silence on Diana's end. Then that's remarkably not territorial of him. I know. Most men would have an opinion about their girlfriend attending their ex-husband's engagement party. Several opinions expressed at volume. He's not most men. Alina meant it without sentiment. It was simply accurate. He made it clear it was my decision. That whatever I chose, he'd be where I left him. And where did you leave him? Tribeca. Probably on his couch with a book about infrastructure investment or something equally thrilling. Diana laughed, short and warm. Go to the party, Alina. Yeah? Close the door. Do it on your own terms, in your own clothes, with that extremely contained billionaire at your side. And then come home and never think about Marcus Varela's feelings again. Alina picked up the wine glass and finally drank from it. Outside, the dog had won. Its owner was being walked, not the other way around. He's not a billionaire, she said. He's absolutely a billionaire, Diana said. I Googled him after the gala. You're welcome. She told Ronan on Thursday, in his kitchen in Tribeca, while he made pasta from scratch, the way he sometimes did on quiet evenings. Not because it was impressive, but because he found it meditative, the repetitive work of it. And she had learned not to comment on it because commenting broke the spell. The apartment was warm and smelled like garlic, and the city was doing its evening thing outside, 10,000 lit windows making the darkness neighborly. I'm going to go, she said, to the engagement party. He was running pasta dough through the machine, his back partially to her, focused on the task with the particular attention he gave, most things not intense exactly, but present. Okay, you don't have a reaction to that? I have several reactions. You want them, yes. He turned the handle. Thin sheets of pasta emerged, pale and smooth. I think you're going, because you need to confirm something for yourself. That he doesn't have any weight with you anymore. That the version of you that would have been destroyed by this party doesn't exist anymore. He paused. I think you're right that she doesn't. And I think you need to be in that room to know it in your body, not just in your head. She sat with that for a moment. The pasta machine turned. And the other reactions? He glanced over his shoulder. Something flickered in his expression, not jealousy. Or not only jealousy, something more complicated and older than that. Marcus is going to use the party to perform. He's built the whole thing as a display, and you walking in gives him an audience he specifically wants. He knows that. He's counting on your presence to validate the production. So I shouldn't go. I didn't say that. He turned back to the pasta. I said he's counting on your presence. What he's not counting on is your indifference. Another pause. Those are different things. She thought about that for long enough that the first batch of pasta was done and hanging to dry before she spoke again. Will you come with me? He didn't hesitate. Yes. You don't have to. I know rooms like that aren't. Alina. He said her name in the flat, direct way that meant he was done with the detour. I said yes. She looked at him at his back, his hands, the careful way he handled things, the way he moved through domestic space like he was always mildly surprised to be somewhere comfortable and trying not to disturb it. She thought about what Diana had said. She thought about the engraved card sitting on her kitchen counter. He's going to try to get to you, she said. Marcus. He's going to figure out you're not. He's going to try to establish that you don't belong there. Ronan was quiet for a moment, then let him try. The engagement party was held on the third Saturday of January, and the Ashford had been transformed in the specific way that very expensive event planning transforms spaces. Everything was white and gold, soft lighting, the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than most people's rent and looked it. The guest list was 300, curated to include the maximum possible density of people whose names appeared in financial press and social columns, because the engagement of Marcus Varela and Celeste Raymond was, at its core, a business announcement dressed in champagne and flowers. Alina wore deep burgundy. Not red she'd considered red and rejected it as trying too hard, but something darker and more assured. She had spent longer getting ready than she'd admitted to herself, and then felt annoyed at spending longer, and then let the annoyance go, because caring about how you look when walking into a difficult room was not vanity, it was self-respect, and she had spent enough years confusing the two. Ronan wore a dark suit that was, if she had to guess, the same one from the Arts Foundation gala or one nearly identical to it. She hadn't asked. He'd arrived at her apartment at 7:30 precisely, and when she'd opened the door, he had looked at her for a quiet moment and said, "You look good," in a tone that was so devoid of performance that it hit harder than any elaboration could have. They took a cab rather than his car, because parking in Midtown on a Saturday was a specific kind of punishment, and in the back seat she was aware of the warmth of him beside her, the city scrolling past the windows in its Saturday night brightness. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "No," she said, and meant it, and then qualified it. Maybe a little. Not afraid nervous. More like before a presentation nervous. Like my body doesn't know the difference between a threat and a high-stakes situation. That's just adrenaline being inefficient. She laughed, short and genuine. That's one way to put it. Your body learned to protect you in a certain environment. It's trying to run the same protocol. It'll figure out the environment changed. She looked at him in the taxi's dim interior, the city light strobing across his face. You talk about survival instinct, like someone who had to pay close attention to it. He was quiet for a beat, the particular quiet that meant he was deciding whether to say something real. I grew up in a place where reading the room correctly was not optional, where you had about 3 seconds to figure out if something was about to go sideways and whether you were going to be in the path of it. She had learned pieces of this over the months. The neighborhood in South Boston that he rarely described directly. The father who'd left when Ronan was 9. The years in between where he'd had to figure out who to trust and how fast and with how much. None of it was offered as explanation or apology, just the plain facts of a life that had been difficult in specific ways before it became something else. "Does it ever stop?" she asked. "The reading the room thing?" "No," he said, without any evident regret. "But you get better at knowing when it's necessary and when it isn't." The cab pulled up to the Ashford. He got out first and offered his hand when she stepped out, which was not a thing he did. Habitually, he was not a performative gentleman, but she understood it for what it was tonight, not performance, but solidarity. She took his hand and kept it. They made it 11 minutes inside before Gerald Raymond found them. 11 minutes was long enough to take in the room, accept a glass of champagne, exchanged 3 separate conversations with people Alina knew from her professional circles who expressed varying degrees of surprise at her presence at her ex-husband's engagement party, and to locate Marcus across the crowd, who had seen them within the first 40 seconds of their arrival and had been visibly recalibrating ever since. Gerald Raymond was 64, a big man in the physical sense that certain men who've spent their lives in rooms where size confers authority tend to become big, not fat, just large, present, filling the space around him with the assumption of consequence. He had white hair and a handshake that he deployed like a credential and a way of looking at people that sorted them into useful and irrelevant before he'd heard them speak. He introduced himself to Alina with the warmth of a man being generous towards someone he considered a complication. Marcus has spoken very highly of you, he said, which was probably untrue and certainly irrelevant. It's good to see there's no unpleasantness. Between families, especially with families coming together, these situations can be... He spread his hands in a gesture that communicated messy without saying it. Not at all, Alina said. I wish them well. Gerald's attention moved to Ronan. The sorting happened in real-time, large man. Physical confidence, suit that wasn't custom, no immediately identifiable social credential in the first 3 seconds. The sort Raymond did on strangers was the blunt instrument version, not the finer calibration of a man who'd been raised to do it. And you are? Ronan Vale. What do you do, Ronan? It was asked the way men like Gerald asked it, not from curiosity, but from assessment. What are you worth to me, and should I bother learning your name? Technology investment, Ronan said. He had answered this question before. He answered it exactly the same way every time, no elaboration, no credential dropping, no attempt to size himself up in response to the implicit challenge. Just the fact, flat and complete. Gerald nodded in the way he'd probably nodded at parking attendants who'd told him their names. Good, good. Lot of opportunity there, meaning I have put you in a category and we are done here. Ronan said nothing. He held his drink and looked at Gerald, with that particular absence of performance that was starting to make Gerald very slightly uncomfortable. There was nothing to push against, no status insecurity to prod, no ego to manage. Just a man standing quietly in a room, entirely undisturbed by Gerald Raymond's opinion of him. If you'll excuse me, Gerald said and moved on. Ronan took a small sip of his drink. He dismissed you, Alina said quietly, I noticed. That doesn't bother you. Should it? He glanced at her. He's going to feel differently later. That's enough. She had no idea at that moment what he meant by that. She found out within the hour. It started near the bar, where a cluster of men who worked in Gerald's orbit had been circling Ronan with the casual menace of people who had decided, on Gerald's cue, that the stranger in their midst was fair game for a certain kind of social testing. One of them a younger man named Prentice Holt, whose family money was in insurance and whose primary function in this social ecosystem appeared to be aggressive, enthusiastic agreement with whatever Gerald Raymond said, had been making comments for 20 minutes that were pointed enough to land but vague enough to deny. It's a great evening, Prentice said, with a particular smile of a man who is about to say something he considers clever. Though I always find these events a little, I don't know, exclusive. Not everyone can really belong in a room like this. You know what I mean? This directed at Ronan with the casual precision of a man who had learned this particular cruelty at prep school. Ronan looked at him. Not really, he said. I just mean, Prentice gestured vaguely at the room, the chandeliers, the flowers, the calibrated wealth of everything. There's a certain context to gatherings like this. It takes a certain kind of person to... I think you're trying to say I don't belong here, Ronan said. Still quiet, no heat in it. If you want to say that, say it plainly. Prentice blinked. He had not expected the sentence to land with such clean, simple directness. The social moves he had available required slippage, required the target to engage in the dance of pretending the insult wasn't an insult. I'm just making conversation. You're not, Ronan said pleasantly. But it's fine. I've been in rooms before where people decided whether I belonged within 3 seconds of seeing me. I'm used to having that decision revised. He said it without menace and without self-pity, and with a precision that made 3 of the men near him go slightly still. Prentice opened his mouth and closed it again. From across the room, Gerald Raymond had been watching. From closer, Marcus had been watching too. He had positioned himself, and Alina saw this clearly, saw the deliberation in it where he could observe Ronan being questioned. where he could see what happened when the social machinery of his fiancée's family closed around the outsider he'd been worried about since the Arts Foundation gala. This had been, she understood now, part of the evening's design. Not just to display his engagement, not just to parade his new life in front of his ex-wife, to watch the man beside her get reduced. Instead, what happened was Gerald Raymond himself crossing the room toward them, because Gerald Raymond had seen something in that exchange that his sorting system had not prepared him for, something about Ronan Vale that had stopped processing correctly, and Gerald was not a man who could tolerate data that didn't fit his categories. Mr. Vale said, "Formal now. The blunt bonhomie was gone. You said technology investment." "I did. I didn't make the connection immediately," but Gerald paused. "A man named Tully, who ran Raymond's financial operations and had been standing near the bar for the last 10 minutes, with the expression of someone who just remembered something important, stepped forward. "Gerald," Tully said quietly. He bent toward Raymond's ear. Said something. Gerald's expression changed. There were, Alina reflected later, several ways to describe what happened to Gerald Raymond's face in that moment. The most accurate was that the sorting system crashed and had to reboot. The confident architecture of a man who had spent 6 decades knowing exactly where everyone in every room ranked relative to him encountered information it couldn't immediately process. And the result was visible, a flicker of something close to uncertainty. "You're the North Star Technologies investor," Gerald said. Not a question anymore. The voice had changed too, not deferential. Gerald Raymond was not capable of deferential but recalibrated. Careful. The voice of a man who has just realized he has been cavalier with someone he should not have been cavalier with. "Among other things," Ronan said. "I wasn't aware you were," Marcus didn't mention. Gerald was assembling himself back into authority, doing it with the practiced speed of a man who rarely had to do it. North Star closed a Series D last spring. 40% stake held privately. 42, Ronan said. That would put the valuation. Gerald stopped. Did the math that his financial mind did automatically. Arrived at a number. "I see. Good," Ronan said with perfect pleasantness. "Then we're on the same page." The room, the immediate cluster of it, the 8 or 10 people close enough to have followed the exchange, had gone very quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something important has just happened, and everyone has registered it, but nobody has decided yet how to respond. Alina watched Prentice Holt take a half step back from Ronan. Watched Gerald Raymond reorganize his posture into something approaching respect, the reluctant mechanical quality of a man whose respect was genuine only when someone had a specific number attached to them. Watched Marcus across the room process what had just occurred. Marcus's face was the most interesting of all. She had spent 8 years reading that face. She knew every configuration of it, the performance, the real thing underneath the performance, the places where they overlapped and the places where they didn't. What she saw now was not simply surprise. It was the expression of a man whose strategy had just broken under him, whose entire architecture for the evening, the choreographed display, the subtle campaign to remind his ex-wife of his ascent and her replacement had just been revealed as smaller than he'd planned. He had invited her here to witness his victory. The room was rearranging itself around the man she'd arrived with. Security materialized near Ronan shortly after, not confrontational but present, 2 men in dark suits, who had the look of people who had been sent to evaluate a situation rather than resolve it. Gerald had apparently dispatched them before Tully had finished his sentence, operating on the original assessment, and now there was a brief, excruciating interval where everyone in the immediate vicinity understood that a grave miscalculation had just been made. Gerald addressed them with a single look and a very small shake of his head. They dissolved back into the crowd. "I apologize," Gerald said to Ronan. The words came out like they had needed significant internal infrastructure to produce. "There was a misunderstanding earlier." "Several," Ronan said. He wasn't unkind. He wasn't savoring it. He simply stated the fact with the same even quality he stated everything, and Gerald received it with the particular gracelessness of a man who was unaccustomed to correction. "Perhaps we can find time to speak properly this evening," Gerald said. A pivot. The quick executive recovery of a man who understood that the gap between him and whoever he'd just misjudged needed to be bridged as efficiently as possible. "Perhaps," Ronan said. Gerald moved away. The cluster of men around Prentice redistributed itself. The room resumed its noise, its champagne, its expensive flowers. A waiter appeared at Ronan's elbow with a fresh drink that nobody had requested. Alina looked at him. He was watching the room with that unhurried attention of his, not triumphant, not satisfied, just present. The same man he had been 20 minutes ago, before the room knew what Gerald Raymond now knew. She understood this was the point. He was the same man. The room's knowledge of him had changed. He hadn't. You knew that would happen, she said quietly. I thought it might. You said earlier that Gerald was going to feel differently later. You knew he'd find out. Someone usually does, Ronan said. In rooms like this, somebody always checks. He paused. I don't lead with it, because it changes how people hear everything I say before they've actually heard me. But I don't hide it either. I just wait. And you're comfortable waiting. I've been comfortable waiting for a long time. Something in his expression shifted just slightly. Something old and private. When you grow up with nothing, you either learn to perform constantly, make yourself look like what you need to be received as, or you learn to wait for the moment when the truth is enough. He looked at her. I ran out of energy for performing somewhere around 32. She thought about Marcus across the room, who had never run out of energy for performing. Who could not, she suspected. Imagine what it would feel like to be unconcerned with how a room perceived him. He's watching us, she said. I know, he looks. I know what he looks like. Ronan's voice was even. It doesn't matter what he looks like. What matters is how you feel right now in this room tonight. She checked. She did the thing she'd been working on in therapy for over a year, the deliberate internal inventory, the honest accounting of what was actually present in her body, rather than what the old reflexes were telling her should be present. Fear? No, not genuinely. Anger? Some. An old low-burning thing that she had been slowly starving of fuel for 18 months and was now barely embers. Regret? For the years, yes. For certain specific mornings in the apartment she'd shared with Marcus. For the version of herself who had spent those years explaining her own feelings to someone who had a professional-grade gift for receiving them and doing nothing with the information. But underneath all of that, something solid. Something that had not been there a year ago and was there now. A quiet, unspectacular foundation. I feel fine, she said. He nodded, believed her. Did not require elaboration. The party continued around them. At some point, Marcus found his way to Celeste, who accepted his arm with a smile that Alina really noticed, didn't quite make it all the way to her eyes. It was the smile of a woman performing a role, which Alina recognized with the specific recognition of someone who had performed the same role in the same ballroom ecosystem for the better part of a decade. She filed it away without knowing why yet. An hour later, while Ronan was in a conversation with a man from the Urban Development Authority that had apparently begun with the Children's Literacy Foundation in the Bronx and expanded from there, Alina was standing near the floral arrangements with a glass of sparkling water when Celeste Raymond appeared at her elbow. Not Marcus's Celeste, the golden dress figure from across the ballroom. This was a different version of Celeste, smaller somehow, up close, younger. The 28 looked more like 24 when the performance of the public role was stepped down, when it was just two women standing near a pillar of white flowers while the party revolved around them. I've been trying to find a moment, Celeste said. Her voice was careful in a way that wasn't quite how she'd spoken earlier in the evening, when she'd been on Marcus's arm. This was the unadorned voice. I know this is strange. Me coming to find you. It is a little, Alina admitted. Celeste looked into her glass. I wanted to say this isn't about him. I'm not here to manage anything on his behalf. He doesn't know I'm talking to you. She paused. I want to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the honest answer. Not the polite answer. Alina waited. What was it like? Celeste asked. At the beginning, before you knew what it was. The question landed with a weight that had nothing performative in it. It was the question of a woman trying to use someone else's map to understand the terrain she was standing in. And Alina felt the shift in the conversation, felt the moment it became something real between them, rather than an awkward social negotiation at a party. She looked at Celeste Raymond carefully. 28. Gold dress. Eyes that were sharper than the role she'd been playing all evening. A woman who had grown up in the specific pressure system of serious money and was practiced at performing confidence she may or may not have actually felt. At the beginning, Alina said slowly, choosing each word, it felt like being chosen. Like someone had looked at all the versions of you and decided on the real one. She paused. He's very good at that. At making you feel seen in a way that feels different from how anyone else has ever seen you. Celeste was very still, and then Alina continued, slowly, you start to notice that the version of you he chose, that specific version, is the only one he's comfortable with. that anything outside of it requires management, explanation, negotiation that you always seem to lose. She stopped. That's when you know. But by then you're 7 years into building a life, and the knowing and the leaving are very different things. Celeste looked at her. The party moved around them in its glittering orbit, oblivious. Somewhere across the room, Marcus was being photographed with Gerald, two men in expensive suits arranging themselves for an image that would appear in someone's social column by morning. He's been asking me to sign something, Celeste said. Her voice had dropped. A financial agreement. My father's attorneys looked at it and had questions, but Marcus said it was standard, that it was that I was being paranoid, that I didn't understand business structures. She paused. He used that word, paranoid. Alina felt the word land in her body like a stone dropped into still water. Paranoid. She knew the specific temperature of that word in Marcus Varella's mouth. She had heard it pointed at herself for years. She had spent a long time believing it. Celeste, she said carefully. I know. The younger woman's jaw was set. I know what I'm saying. Is there someone? Alina stopped herself. Started again. This was not a conversation she had expected to have tonight, at this party, in this ballroom. And she was aware that she was navigating in real time, that what she said in the next 30 seconds might matter to this woman for a long time. Is there someone in your life who knows what's happening? Outside your family, your father, someone whose only interest is you? Celeste was quiet for a long moment, then no, not really. Find someone. Alina kept her voice low and even. Before you sign anything, before any more conversations about what's standard and what you understand, find someone who is only on your side and talk to them. Celeste nodded. Small, precise, the nod of a woman absorbing information she had already suspected and needed someone else to confirm. I should get back, she said. He'll notice if I'm... Go, Alina said, and Celeste. The younger woman looked at her. Paranoid isn't a personality flaw. It's a word people use when they want you to stop paying attention. Something shifted in Celeste's expression. Relief, maybe, or the particular release of a tension you've been carrying for so long you stopped noticing its weight. She nodded once more and moved back into the crowd, the gold dress catching the chandelier light, the public role reassembling itself around her as she walked. Alina stood by the white flowers for a moment. She found Ronan 20 minutes later, still in conversation with the urban development man, which had now apparently expanded to include a woman who turned out to run the city's affordable housing policy division, and who was looking at Ronan with the expression of someone who has just found an unexpected source of useful funding. Alina touched his arm lightly, and he included her in the conversation without breaking it, the easy naturalness of two people who had learned how to occupy the same space without managing each other. Later in the cab home, the city moving past them in its Saturday night cascade, she told him about Celeste. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened fully, not waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. She came to you, he said. Yes. Not because she knew what she'd find, just because you were the only one there who'd already been through it. That's what I think, yes. He nodded slowly. Outside, the Lincoln Center fountain was lit against the winter dark, water catching the light and throwing it back in fragments. What are you going to do about it? I don't know yet. She leaned her head back against the seat. I told her to find someone to talk to, someone outside the family. I gave her my number. Good. It might not come to anything. It might not, he agreed. But she asked, and you answered honestly. That's what you could do tonight. The cab moved through the dark and the cold, and the city that was always, at every hour, doing several things at once. Alina felt the evening settling in her, not triumphantly, not with the clean narrative satisfaction of having won something, because that wasn't what had happened. What had happened was messier and more human than winning. She had walked into a room built to diminish her and found instead a woman who needed something real. She had given it. The rest of it, Marcus's expression when the room recalibrated around Ronan, Gerald Raymond's stiff recalibration, the whole elaborate performance that had collapsed quietly under its own weight, all of it felt very far away now, like weather that had passed. Ronan's hand found hers in the dark of the cab. Not for effect. Just because it was there. She let it stay. Celeste Raymond called on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the engagement party. Alina was between meetings, standing in the narrow hallway outside her studio's conference room with a set of revised blueprints tucked under her arm and a coffee that was already cooling in her other hand, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. She was 20 minutes from presenting to a client who had opinions about everything, and the patience for none of them, but something made her answer. Instinct, maybe. Or the memory of Celeste's face near the white flowers, the way the public role had stepped down and left something younger and less certain underneath. "It's Celeste," the voice said. "Careful." Quiet in a way that suggested she was in a space where being overheard was a concern. "Raymond, I know this is I know I probably shouldn't be calling." "You should," Alina said. She moved further down the hallway, away from the conference room door. "I'm glad you did." A pause. The sound of a city street in the background, a cab horn, wind. She was outside somewhere. "I talked to someone. An attorney. Not my father's people, someone outside. A woman I found through a friend who does family law." Another pause. Longer this time. She had a lot of questions about the financial agreement Marcus asked me to sign. She said the structure of it was, she used the word unusual. Unusual how? "It redirects a portion of my family trust income through a holding company he controls for the duration of the marriage." She said it was written to look like a standard asset protection clause, but the mechanics of it were different. More extractive was her word. Celeste's voice was controlled, but the control was effortful. The voice of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was executing it with concentration. She said I should not sign it, under any circumstances. Alina leaned against the hallway wall. The blueprints dug into her ribs. "Have you told your father?" "I tried. He said Marcus explained it to him already, that I was misunderstanding the purpose. He said the attorney I'd spoken to was probably not experienced enough in high-net-worth structures to—" She stopped. Alina heard her exhale. He used the word naive, about my concerns. The word landed with its full weight. Alina knew the weight of that word in this specific configuration, a woman's concern about her own financial safety being filed under feminine naivety by a man who had already decided the concern wasn't real. She had lived inside that filing system for years. "Celeste," she said carefully, "I want to ask you something directly." "Okay. Do you want to marry him?" The silence that followed was the kind that contains its own answer. Not a pause while someone formulates a response, a pause while someone decides whether to stop lying to themselves out loud. "I don't know," Celeste said finally. "I thought I did. He was at the beginning. He made me feel like I was the only person in a room full of people. Like I was interesting in a way that nobody else had noticed." She stopped. "You described that. At the party. That feeling." "I did." "Yeah. A hollow exhale. I've been with him 9 months. We've been engaged for 3. My father likes him, and my father doesn't like most people. So when he approved, I thought that meant something. I thought it was evidence." She paused. "I think I mistook my father's approval for my own." Alina felt the particular sadness of that sentence. Not dramatic sadness, the quiet, accurate kind. The kind that arrives when someone younger than you says something true about themselves that took you years longer to say. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet. I'm figuring out who I need to talk to. What I need to understand before I decide anything." Celeste paused. "I wanted to tell you, because you told me to find someone outside the family. And I did, and what she said mattered. I wanted you to know it mattered." Alina's client presentation was starting in 16 minutes. She stood in the hallway and felt the two realities pressing against each other, the professional life she had built with considerable effort over the past 18 months, and this conversation, which had no scheduled time and no deliverable and no resolution she could hand someone. "I'm glad you found her," Alina said. "Whatever you decide about the marriage, about the agreement, make sure every decision you make is yours. Not your father's. Not Marcus's. Not what you think the situation requires." She paused. "That sounds obvious. It isn't." "No," Celeste said. "It isn't." After she hung up, Alina stood in the hallway for another moment. Then she went into the conference room and presented the revised blueprints with the focused competence she had spent years building. The professional self that had survived the marriage and the divorce and the slow reconstruction of a life, and she did not think about Marcus Varela or Celeste Raymond for the next 2 hours. She thought about them on the way home. She told Ronan that evening. He was in his Tribeca apartment, just back from 3 days in San Francisco for a board meeting, and there was a jet-lagged quality to him, not tired exactly, but slightly displaced, the look of a man whose body was still consulting an earlier time zone. He'd ordered Thai food that was sitting on the counter in paper bags, and they were eating at the kitchen table with the particular comfortable informality of 2 people who had stopped performing domesticity at each other and were just doing it. She told him about the call. He listened. He asked two questions: what exactly the attorney had described about the financial agreement structure, and whether Celeste had said anything about Marcus's response when she'd raised concerns with him directly. Alina answered both. He ate, he thought. That's not unusual for Marcus, he said finally. The financial structure. I've had my people pull his public filings since the engagement was announced. His holding company has been running consistent cash flow anomalies for about 18 months. Outflow exceeds what the declared revenue streams can reasonably account for. Alina looked at him across the takeout containers. You had people pull his filings, he met her eyes. Didn't apologize for it. You're in my life. He was in your life for 8 years, and he had significant control over your finances during that time. I wanted to understand what I was looking at. He paused. I should have told you I was doing it. Yes, she said. You should have. I'm telling you now. After the fact. After the fact, he agreed. He held her gaze. That was wrong. I was managing information instead of sharing it, which is exactly the kind of thing you should be able to call me on. She looked at him for a moment. The honest delivery of that no defensive architecture around it, no explaining himself into acceptability, was still something she was getting used to. Marcus had been extraordinary at appearing to take accountability. There was always a but coming, always a recalibration of who had actually been the wronged party. Ronan's apologies, when they came, were just apologies. Complete sentences with no additional clauses. What did your people find? She asked. Nothing provable yet. Anomalies, pattern inconsistencies. The kind of thing that looks like nothing until something breaks it open. He pushed a container toward her. The SEC has a mandate to look at exactly this kind of pattern. Whether they currently are, I don't know. But they might be. Companies in his sector have been under increased scrutiny for the past year. He's a small fish, but small fish get caught in wide nets. He paused. If Celeste's attorney files a complaint related to the financial agreement, if that document gets properly examined, it could be the thing that breaks it open. It could be. Or it might not. I don't want to tell you it's certain when it isn't. He looked at her. What I'm fairly certain of is that Marcus is managing money he doesn't have clear title to, and that the engagement to Celeste was not primarily romantic. Alina thought about the engraved invitation. I hope you'll come. I mean that. The handwriting of a man who needed witnesses to his success. She thought about his face at the party when the room had reorganized itself around Ronan. The recalculation. The something behind the eyes that had looked, for just a moment, like a man understanding that the performance he'd been running was losing its audience. He's scared, she said. He has reason to be. He doesn't know that you know any of this. No, and I'm not going to tell him. That's not my job. Ronan took a sip of water. His choices are his to live with. Whatever comes from them, that's just consequence. Not something I engineered. She believed him. One of the things she had slowly, cautiously come to trust about Ronan Vale was that his moral accounting was scrupulously accurate. He didn't position himself as righteous. He didn't perform restraint. He simply had a clear line inside himself between what was his business and what wasn't, and he stayed on his side of it with a consistency that she had initially found baffling. Having spent 8 years with a man who considered everything potentially within his jurisdiction. There's something else, she said. He waited. Celeste said she's not sure she wants to marry him. She didn't say it directly, but it was there. She pushed her food around the container. If she pulls out, if she goes to her father with what her attorney found, and Gerald Raymond pulls the alliance. Marcus loses the financial runway the Raymond connection was giving him, and whatever is holding the rest of it together starts to show its cracks. Ronan nodded slowly. That's probably true. I didn't tell her any of that. About the filing anomalies. She doesn't know any of this. Alina set down her fork. I didn't go to that party to dismantle anything. I went to close a door. You did close a door, Ronan said. What she does with her own door is separate. You gave her honest answers to honest questions. What she builds from that belongs to her. She absorbed that. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, unconcerned with the small human reckoning happening in a Tribeca kitchen over Thai food and the wreckage of someone else's bad choices. I'm angry at him, she said. Not dramatically, just the plain statement of it. I know, not for me at this point. I'm past most of that. She paused. For her, 28 years old, standing in that ballroom with that smile that didn't reach her eyes, and he's already doing to her the version of what he spent 8 years doing to me. And she's in the earlier part of it, before you know the name of what it is. Ronan was quiet for a long moment. The takeout container sat between them. You gave her the name, he said. Tonight on the phone. She knows now. Is hers, Alina finished. Yes. She picked up her fork again. They ate in silence for a while, comfortable silence, the kind that had taken time to build, and now felt like the most natural thing, two people in the kitchen not needing to fill the space between them. Ronan. Yeah. Thank you for telling me about the filings. Even after the fact. He nodded, set his own fork down. I don't want to be someone who manages you. He paused, and she could see him choosing words with care, which he did when the thing he was saying mattered to him more than usual. I've spent a long time operating alone, making decisions in isolation because that was the only way to make them. Some of those habits are harder to revise than I expected. I know, she said. I can see you revising them. Slowly. Slowly is fine. She looked at him across the table. I'm not in a hurry. Something in his expression shifted the same thing she'd seen before that she still hadn't fully named. A man encountering patience he hadn't believed in and adjusting his understanding of what was possible. He reached across the table and took her hand, briefly, and then let it go and picked up his fork again, because that was how he was the gesture given and complete, not held for effect, not milked for the warmth of it. That was fine too. The story broke on a Thursday. Not the story Alina had been half expecting, not the financial irregularities, not the SEC, nothing that Ronan's quiet research had been mapping. Something different. Smaller at first, the way these things often were, and then rapidly larger. It started with a business column in a financial newsletter that Alina would not normally have seen, except that Priya forwarded it to her with a single-word message, Varela. The column was about a class of mid-market investment firms that had been inflating client returns through a combination of selective reporting and fee structures that obscured actual performance. It was the third piece in a series, and Marcus's firm, Varela Capital, was named not as the primary subject, but as a related example, a company whose disclosed performance numbers had been drawing questions from industry analysts for several months. The column was careful, lawyered within an inch of its life, full of conditional language and phrases like questions have been raised and according to sources familiar with the matter. It named no crimes, it established no definitive wrongdoing. It was, however, the kind of piece that people in Marcus's world forwarded to each other within the first 2 hours, with 3-word messages expressing varying degrees of satisfaction or alarm. By 11 in the morning, Alina had received 4 separate texts from people she knew through professional circles who had seen it. By noon, Diana had called. By 2 in the afternoon, she was aware that the story had cleared the financial niche press and was appearing in the business sections of 2 general interest publications. She did not call Ronan. She texted him, saw the column, and he replied 40 minutes later, saw it. Call you tonight if that's okay. She said it was. She spent the afternoon working. She had a site visit in Queens for a school renovation project she'd been developing for 3 months, and she walked the hallways of the building with her notebook and her phone camera, and the measured professional attention the work deserved, and she did not spend that time thinking about Marcus Varela. She thought about him on the subway back. Not with satisfaction, she checked for that specifically, wanting to be honest with herself, because satisfaction would have meant his downfall was doing something for her ego, and she did not want his downfall to be doing something for her ego. What she found instead was something older and more complicated. Relief partly. The particular relief of someone who spent years being told their perceptions were distorted, their concerns exaggerated, their reading of a situation naive, and then watching the situation produce exactly the evidence they'd been told didn't exist. It wasn't vindication exactly. It was more like standing in a room after a long time and feeling the floor hold your weight when you'd spent years being told. The floor was solid and privately suspecting it wasn't. There was also something she didn't have a clean word for. A sadness that wasn't grief, not for him, but for the particular waste of it, the years, the energy, the precision with which he had dismantled her confidence. So gradually, she hadn't noticed the scope of the project until it was mostly done. The sadness of understanding that a person can be both fully responsible for what they do and also somehow ordinary in their capacity for it. Marcus was not a monster. He was a man who had learned early that managing people's perceptions of him was more effective than being trustworthy, and he had gotten very good at the management, and eventually it had become all there was. She got off the subway at her stop and walked the 3 blocks to her building in the cold February air. The city was doing its post-5 o'clock thing, the daytime people going home, the evening people starting, the brief overlap where everyone was on the street at once, and the density of it felt almost like warmth. Ronan called at 7:30. "How are you doing?" he said. No preamble. "Okay, genuinely okay, I think." She was at her kitchen counter with a cup of tea she'd made mostly out of habit. "It's strange. I thought seeing something like this would feel more dramatic." "It rarely does," he said. "Real things are usually quieter than expected. Have you heard anything beyond the column?" "Some." A pause, not hesitance, more like selection. It's choosing what was useful to share. The column was sourced. Somebody with access to internal performance data gave that reporter enough to go on record. That's not a leak. That's a decision. Another pause. The SEC inquiry my team was tracking it became formal today. Subpoenas were issued this morning. Non-public information as of this afternoon, but these things surface. How do you know? I know people who know things. I don't always like how those networks work, but they exist, and tonight they're useful. He paused. Varela Capital has about 60 to 90 days before this becomes significantly more serious in public. Maybe less. Alina sat with that. The tea steamed in her cup. Celeste. "Yes," he said. "If she's going to make a decision, she should make it soon. Before this becomes the context of whatever she decides. I can't tell her that. I can't call her and say the man you're engaged to is under investigation. Make your exit now." She paused. "That's not—" "No," he agreed. "That's not yours to manage." He was quiet for a moment. "But you can be reachable if she calls again. She has my number. Then that's what you can do." She wrapped both hands around the teacup. The kitchen was quiet. "He's going to call me," she said. "When it gets worse, he'll call." Ronan didn't ask how she knew. He trusted her reading of Marcus, which was one of the many things she had come to appreciate about him. He did not require her to justify her understanding of her own experience. "What are you going to do when he does?" "I don't know yet." She thought about it genuinely. "I'm not going to help him, obviously. But I don't want to be someone who relishes it, whatever happens to him." "You won't," Ronan said. "Simple, certain. You don't know that, I know you." A pause. "You can be angry at someone and still not want to be there when they fall. Those aren't contradictions." She thought about that for a while after they hung up. Celeste called the following Monday. Not carefully this time, not the controlled quiet of a woman who'd stepped outside to make a private call. She called at 10:40 in the morning, and she sounded different, not panicked, but stripped of something, some layer of management that had been in place every time they'd spoken before. Her voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when a decision has been made, and the energy that was previously spent on deciding has been redirected elsewhere. "I'm ending the engagement," she said. "I told my father this morning." Alina was at her drafting table. She set down her pencil. "How did he take it?" "Poorly at first. Then I showed him what my attorney had documented about the financial agreement and some other things she'd found when she started looking deeper, some discrepancies in Marcus's firm's reported numbers that had been flagged in the past." She paused. "My father went very quiet, and then he said he needed to make some calls." And Marcus a brief silence. When Celeste spoke again, there was something in her voice that Alina recognized, not satisfaction, not grief, but the particular clarity of someone who has just done an extremely difficult thing and found that they survived it. "He came to the house. I was there with my attorney, and I told him we were ending the engagement and that any further communication should go through counsel. He didn't take that quietly, no. A small exhale. He shifted a lot. Between sorry and angry and sorry again, and then there was a version where he said I was making a mistake that I'd regret. And then a version where he needed me to understand what was at stake for him professionally. And then she stopped. And then he said something about how the women in his life had never been able to see what he was really trying to build. That we always left before we could understand the full picture. Alina closed her eyes for a moment. She recognized that sentence too. She had heard close variants of it. The pivot from apology to grievance, the reframing of his own behavior as something that had been done to him by insufficient women. She had spent years in the machinery of that sentence. "Celeste," she said, "you did the right thing." "I know." Celeste said it like a woman who needed to say it out loud a few more times before it settled into her bones. "I know I did. It doesn't feel clean, though. I thought it would feel cleaner." "It doesn't," Alina said. "It feels like you just went through something." "Which you did." My father, she stopped, started again. "He keeps saying he should have looked more carefully. that he approved the engagement without doing proper due diligence because Marcus was charming and came with the right credentials, and my father trusted his own read of people too much. A pause. He's been in business for 40 years. He thought he knew how to read men. Another pause. He feels stupid. He was fooled by someone who had a lot of practice at fooling people, Alina said. That's not stupidity. That's how Marcus works. He's very good at it. She paused. Gerald isn't going to forgive that easily. No, Celeste said. He is not. Alina heard it in those 3 words, the weight of what Gerald Raymond's institutional capacity for retribution might look like when directed at someone who had deceived him and attempted to extract value from his family. Gerald had dismissed Ronan in 30 seconds at his own engagement party. He would not make the same categorical error with Marcus Varela. He would not be careless twice. Are you safe? Alina asked. Financially. Physically, are you in a good position? Yes. The agreement was never signed. My trust is intact. My attorney has documented everything. A pause. I'm staying at my father's apartment uptown for now. My own place, we'd moved some of my things into his apartment, Marcus's, and I'll deal with that later. Okay, Alina. The voice went a register quieter. I don't think I would have made the call to the attorney if you hadn't told me to find someone. I'd been convincing myself it was normal, that I was reading it wrong. He was very good at making me think I was reading it wrong. Alina thought about her own years of reading things wrong, the slow erosion of confidence in her own perceptions, the particular loneliness of trusting someone else's version of reality more than your own. You weren't reading it wrong, she said. I know that now. A pause. I'm sorry. For what he put you through, for the years of it. The apology was unexpected, and it arrived with a precision that made Alina's throat tighten briefly, not with grief, but with something like recognition, the acknowledgement, from an unexpected source, that the years had been real, that the things she'd survived had actually happened. That's not yours to apologize for, Alina said. But thank you. After they hung up, Alina sat at her drafting table for a while without working. The revised blueprints of the Long Island City project were spread in front of her, and she looked at them without quite seeing them. The building still wanted to be 2 things at once. She thought she might finally understand how to let it. Marcus called on a Wednesday, not the Wednesday after Celeste's call. The one after that, the one where the financial newsletter published its second piece on Varela Capital, this one less carefully worded than the first. This one naming specific funds and specific discrepancies. This one citing a source described as a former senior employee who had elected to cooperate with investigators. She saw the piece that morning. She was on her way into the studio when it came through her news feed, and she read it standing on the sidewalk outside her building, while a February wind worked its way through her coat, and she thought, today or tomorrow. 2 days tops. It was the same day, 11:50 in the morning. Her phone buzzed, and the screen showed his name, and she stood in her office doorway for a moment, not afraid, not bracing for impact, but taking the half-second to arrive in herself fully before she answered. Marcus. Alina. His voice was controlled, barely. The control was a visible effort in a way it had never been. When they were married, he had always been effortless in the performance, and now the effort was showing through. I need to talk to you. You're talking to me. In person. Or no, you wouldn't. I need you to understand what's happening. What's being the piece this morning is not accurate. It's not the full picture. It's a version of Marcus. Events that completely ignores the context of how this sector operates. These are standard industry practices that have been. Marcus, she said again, quieter. The word placed like a hand on a door that was trying to open too fast. He stopped. I read the piece, she said. I'm not in a position to have a conversation about its accuracy. That's a conversation for your attorneys. My attorneys are... He stopped again. Reorganized. When he spoke again, the performance had stepped down, and what was underneath was less polished and more honest and somehow harder to listen to than anything he'd said in his performing voice. I'm in trouble, Alina, genuine trouble. And I need. What do you need, Marcus? A pause. I need you to speak to Celeste. I need you to tell her that what she's heard from her attorney was that it was being presented in the worst possible light. You know me. You know how I operate. You were with me for 8 years. And whatever you might think of how we ended, you know I'm not. Stop, she said, quiet but absolute. Alina, stop. She moved away from her office doorway further down the hall where Priya couldn't see her face. I'm not going to speak to Celeste on your behalf. I'm not going to speak to anyone on your behalf. I'm not a resource you have access to for situations like this. I was your wife. I'm not your wife. Those are different things. You were my wife. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Not performed, she heard the real thing under it, the genuine desperation of a man who had run out of moves. You were my wife for 8 years, and whatever went wrong between us, I know I didn't. I made mistakes, Alina. Real ones. I know that. But you don't want to watch me lose everything. You're not that person. She breathed. She made herself slow down. She thought about Celeste standing in that ballroom near the white flowers, the smile that didn't reach her eyes, the word paranoid in Marcus's mouth directed at a 28-year-old woman's entirely legitimate concern about her own financial safety. You're right, she said. I'm not the person who wants to watch you lose everything. I don't want that. I genuinely don't. She paused. But I'm also not the person who's going to stand between you and the consequences of what you've done. Those are your consequences, Marcus. They belong to you. Alina, you called Celeste paranoid, she said. It came out even and flat, and she didn't dress it up. When she asked reasonable questions about an agreement that her attorney later described as extractive. You used the same word on her that you spent years using on me. And I want you to hear me when I say that word didn't make her wrong. It didn't make me wrong. It just made us both doubt ourselves for longer than we should have. Silence. I don't hate you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I spent a long time being angry, and there's still some of that, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I don't hate you, and I don't wish you destroyed. I wish you, she paused, looked for the honest version of what she wished. I wish you'd spent the energy you put into managing everyone around you into actually looking at yourself. I think you might have been able to build something real. He was quiet for so long she thought the call had dropped. You already have someone, he said finally. Not an accusation. Something flatter and more defeated than that. You've already. This has nothing to do with Ronan, she said. This is about you and me and 8 years and the decision I made to leave and the life I'm building. Ronan is part of that life. But this conversation, what I'm telling you right now, none of it is about him. Another long pause. She heard him breathe. The ragged, non-performative version of his breath. A man sitting somewhere in his expensive apartment with the story in the financial press this morning, and the subpoenas and the engagement that had just ended, and the ex-wife on the phone who was not going to save him. You don't owe me anything, he said. It came out like he was testing the sentence, hearing it for the first time, not sure he believed it. No, she said, I don't. He stopped. I thought you would always. I know what you thought. She kept her voice even. You thought that however it ended between us, you'd retain a certain access, that I'd remain in your orbit in some way, available for situations like this one. She paused. That's how you saw me, Marcus, as something retained. I know you didn't think of it that way, but that's what it was. He said nothing. I hope, she said, and meant it, that you find people who are actually on your side through this. Real people, not resources. I hope you figure out the difference. She paused. I have to go. Alina, goodbye, Marcus. She hung up. She stood in the hallway of her studio with her phone in her hand. For a moment, the city going about its business 12 floors below. She breathed. She inventoried herself the way she'd learned to honestly, not charitably, not harshly, just accurately. She felt tired, not devastated, not victorious, just tired in the clean way that follows something genuinely difficult. She felt the faint residue of sadness for the years, for the version of herself who had believed in the version of him he had constructed. She felt the bedrock of something firmer below all of it. She felt like herself, entirely herself, in a way that had nothing to do with what Marcus Varela was going through today, or would go through tomorrow. She texted Ronan, he called. I'm okay. Can we talk tonight? His reply came back in 7 minutes. Yes, I'll be here. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. She told Ronan about the call that night over the phone, standing at her apartment window with the city doing its February thing below, cold and bright and entirely indifferent to the human accounting happening 11 floors up. She told him the whole of it. Not the edited version, not the version organized for easy consumption, but the actual thing, Marcus's voice cracking, the moment he'd said you were my wife, the specific words she had chosen and why, the way she'd felt afterward. Ronan listened without interruption, which was one of the things she had stopped taking for granted about him, the quality of his listening. Not patience exactly patience implied, waiting for something to end. This was different. This was attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about how you handled it? He asked. Good, she said. Then more honestly, mostly good. There was a moment he said something about how he thought I would always be available to him. And I told him that's how he'd seen me. as something retained. She paused. I don't know if that was kind. I don't know if kindness was what the moment needed. Was it true? Yes. Then it was what the moment needed. She shifted the phone to her other ear. Below, a cab pulled up to the building across the street, and a couple got out, the woman laughing at something before the door had fully closed. He's going to try again. Maybe not soon, but he will. When it gets worse and the calls he makes stop going through. Probably, Ronan said. And you'll handle it the same way. I think so. She meant it. Not with the forced conviction of someone trying to believe something, but with the genuine quiets of someone who had just learned something about themselves and found it reliable. I didn't feel afraid. That's the thing that surprised me most. I picked up the phone, knowing who it was, and I didn't feel afraid. You weren't afraid of him when you left either, Ronan said. You were exhausted. Those aren't the same. She thought about that. He was right in the specific way he was often right, not broadly, not philosophically, but with the precision of someone who had been paying close attention and was reporting accurately. I spent a long time after the divorce mistaking the aftermath of exhaustion for the aftermath of fear, she said. My therapist and I argued about that for a while. Who won? She did. A pause. She usually does. Good therapist. Yes. She leaned her forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. The street below moved through its evening rhythms. I keep thinking about what he said, that I'd always be available, that there was some version of me that belonged to the history of us that he could call on. She paused. I think he genuinely believed that, not as a manipulation underneath the manipulation. I think he actually believed it. Some people, Ronan said, confuse the fact that they affected someone deeply with the belief that they still have access to them. Like damage confers ownership. She turned that sentence over. It was precise enough to be uncomfortable. Is that something you learned or something you experienced? A pause, longer than usual, bit of both, he said. There was someone, a long time ago, before I had anything, who thought that because they'd been there when I had nothing, they had a claim on everything that came after. He stopped. I'm not equating that to your situation, I know. Tell me anyway. He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the quality of it, the pause of a man deciding how far into himself to reach for something that mattered. Her name was Dara. We were together for 3 years starting when I was 24. She was present during the worst of the building period. The years where I was working 60-hour weeks for barely anything, trying to get the first fund off the ground. She was there, and that was real, and I don't diminish it. He paused. When things started working, she had a very specific idea about what that meant for her. Not financially, or not only financially. She thought my success was partly hers because she'd witnessed the effort, that she was owed access to the outcome because she'd been present during the process. What happened? I ended it. It took longer than it should have because I felt guilty for succeeding past the version of me she'd agreed to be with, like I'd changed the terms without her consent. He paused. It took me a while to understand that people don't own you for having known you when you were smaller. Alina was quiet for a moment. Outside, the couple from the cab had disappeared into the building across the street, the door swinging shut behind them. That's what Marcus thinks, she said, that he owns something because he was present. Because I was his. Yes, he's going to be very surprised, she said, to find out that owning something and it belonging to you are different things. She heard something in the silence on his end, not amusement exactly, but its quieter cousin. Yes, he said again, he is. March arrived with the grudging minimalism of a New York early spring, some days almost warm. Most days not. The city in its transitional mode of people wearing coats they'd already decided were too heavy but weren't quite ready to replace with something lighter. The trees on the streets near Alina's studio were doing the preliminary work of returning to themselves, small tight buds on branches that had been bare for months, and she noticed them every morning on her walk from the subway with the specific attention she gave to things that were coming back from somewhere difficult. The Varela Capital story had settled into the steady low burn of an ongoing investigation rather than the flash of breaking news. The SEC formal inquiry had been reported publicly now, and the financial press was doing the careful, lawyer-adjacent work of documenting what was known and speculating about what would follow. Varela Capital had lost 4 major clients in 2 weeks. 2 of Marcus's senior associates had retained separate counsel, which the financial press correctly identified as a significant development. Marcus himself had released a statement through his PR firm that said, essentially, that he was cooperating fully with all relevant authorities and was confident that the investigation would confirm the integrity of his operations, which was the kind of statement that nobody believed but that preserved legal optionality. Alina read these updates when they came through and then put them aside. She had work. She had good work, the kind that had been building steadily since she'd left Marcus and rebuilt her client base, slowly, without shortcuts, through the quality of what she produced and the professional reputation she'd maintained through the worst of the personal wreckage. The Long Island City project had finally resolved itself. She had found the way to let the building be two things at once without compromising either, which turned out to require less architectural ingenuity than it required simply being willing to sit with the tension long enough to understand it. She presented the final design in mid-March to a client who looked at it for a long time without speaking, which was either a very good sign or a very bad sign, and then said, "This is what I was trying to describe for 2 years and couldn't," which turned out to be very good. She called Ronan on the walk back from the meeting, because she wanted to tell someone, and he was the person she wanted to tell. "The Long Island City design," she said when he picked up. The client just approved it. "I know that project's been giving you trouble," he said. "The building that wanted to be two things. I figured out how to let it be both." "How?" "I stopped treating the tension as a problem to solve and started treating it as a structural element. Built the design around the fact that it contains contradictions rather than trying to eliminate them." She paused, which is probably some kind of metaphor for something, but I'm choosing not to examine it too closely. He made a sound that was as close to a laugh as he usually got on the phone. "Congratulations." "Thank you." She stepped around a street vendor selling coffee from a cart, the smell hitting her warm and familiar in the cold air. "How's San Francisco?" "Efficient," he said, which was his standard description of cities that worked well, and he didn't particularly enjoy. He was in California for the week, a combination of board commitments, and a meeting with an infrastructure fund he'd been in conversation with for several months. They had developed a functional long-distance rhythm during his travel periods, regular calls, the occasional late-night conversation where the time zone gap made everything feel slightly more candid than usual. A steady low hum of presence that didn't require constant performance to sustain. "When are you back?" "Saturday, late flight." A pause. "I thought maybe Sunday we could do the charity art thing." "The one in Williamsburg." She'd mentioned the event a month ago, a small annual showcase organized by a collective of emerging artists, some of whom were former students from the youth programs the Arts Foundation supported. The kind of event with no chandelier and no 300-person guest list and no one performing status at each other across the room. She hadn't known if he'd remembered. He'd remembered. "Sunday works," she said. "Good." A pause, then in the dry, flat tone he used for things that were actually funny to him, "Should I wear my $800 suit?" She laughed on the street, genuinely, the kind of laugh that surprised her a little with its own completeness. "Only if you want Prentice Holt to feel better about himself." Then definitely not. The call she hadn't expected came on a Friday morning, and it wasn't from Marcus. It was from a woman named Sonia Park, who introduced herself as a senior investigative journalist at a publication Alina respected and had read for years. Sonia Park covered financial accountability, corporate misconduct, investor fraud, the particular ecosystem of money and power where the distance between legal and ethical opened into a chasm that certain people made entire careers of navigating. "I'm working on a longer piece about Varela Capital," Sonia said. She was direct, not pushy, the voice of someone who understood that her credibility depended on people trusting the conversation enough to engage with it. The SEC inquiry, the client losses, the pattern of activity going back about 3 years. I've spoken with former employees, with several of his investors, with people in his professional network. A pause. "I've also been told you were married to him for 8 years and that you left him approximately 18 months ago." Alina was in her studio, the Long Island City blueprints still spread across her drafting table in their newly approved form. The small good feeling of the previous day's client meeting not quite dissipated yet. "Who told you that?" "I have several sources. I'm not in a position to identify them, but I want you to know I'm not relying on a single account." Sonia's voice was even. "I'm not asking you to comment on the investigation or on any financial matters. I understand that's not your area. What I'm interested in is something different." "What are you interested in?" "The human pattern," Sonia said. "The way this kind of conduct extends beyond the boardroom. A man who operates the way Marcus Varela appears to have operated in his professional life, the misrepresentation, The systematic management of other people's perceptions that's not a separate mode from who he is personally. It's the same skill set operating in different arenas. A pause. I've spoken with Celeste Raymond. She agreed to speak with me with her attorney present. She was very candid. Alina absorbed that. Celeste had moved quickly. Whether that was courage or urgency or her father's influence now operating in a different direction, Alina couldn't tell. Maybe all three. What do you want from me? I'd like to speak with you. On background first, nothing attributed. Nothing that puts your name in the piece, unless you choose to go on record at some point. Just a conversation that helps me understand the full shape of what I'm looking at. Another pause. Ms. Marquez, I'm not trying to build a case. I'm trying to understand a person. The piece I'm writing is about accountability. And accountability requires that we understand not just what someone did, but who they are in the round. That includes this. Alina got up from her drafting table and moved to the window. The street below had its mid-morning population delivery trucks, a woman walking two dogs, with the resigned determination of someone who had agreed to walk two dogs and was now committed to that decision, a group of architecture students from the university nearby making their field survey trip through the neighborhood with notebooks and phone cameras. She thought about accountability. She thought about what it meant that the word had appeared in the same week from two separate directions from Ronan, describing what was coming for Marcus without rancor, and now from a journalist who was building the public record of it. I'll speak with you on background, she said, not because I want him destroyed. I want to be clear about that. I don't. She paused. But I spent 8 years inside a version of this story, and if my understanding of it helps you understand what you're looking at, I think I can do that. Sonia Park asked if they could meet the following week. They met on a Tuesday, in a coffee shop in the West Village that Sonia had suggested, small, not especially fashionable, the kind of place where conversations could be private without feeling secretive. Sonia was 40, compact, with the specific quality of alertness that good investigative journalists shared with certain people Alina had met in Ronan's world, the ability to be genuinely still while remaining completely present. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Alina did not talk about the worst of it. Not because she was protecting Marcus, she was past that, but because the worst of it was hers, and she was careful about what she gave away and to whom and in what form. She talked about the patterns she recognized. The way confidence had been weaponized not loudly, not obviously, but with the quiet consistency of something designed to function below the threshold of visibility. The financial control that had been gradual enough to feel like partnership until the partnership was gone and the control remained. The specific experience of having her own perceptions, managed, questioned, returned to her slightly altered until she stopped trusting them. She talked about what leaving had required. Not practically, it had been difficult, but navigable, but psychologically. The work of rebuilding a self that had been systematically undermined, not through cruelty, but through something almost more insidious, through being managed, through being handled so skillfully that she had not felt the handling. Sonja listened, took notes, asked questions that were precise and respectful, questions that assumed Alina was a competent adult who had made her own choices and experienced her own experiences, not a victim waiting to be properly classified. At the end of it, Sonia looked at her notes and then looked at Alina. Can I ask you something off the record? Sure. The man you're with now. What's he like? Alina looked at her. The coffee shop moved around them in its ordinary Tuesday way. Why? Because I've been doing this for 17 years. Talking to people who've come through situations like yours. And the ones who are genuinely okay afterward have usually found something. Some understanding that isn't about the person who hurt them. I'm curious what yours is. Alina thought about it. She thought about Ronan in San Francisco this week, in efficient meetings about infrastructure investment, probably having dinner alone because he genuinely didn't mind eating alone, probably reading something technical and absorbing on the flight back Saturday. She thought about his hands on pasta dough. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when she'd opened the door in Burgundy before the engagement party and said, "You look good," in a voice with no performance in it. He's quiet, she said finally. He's very quiet, and he's been through things, and he doesn't pretend he hasn't, and he doesn't try to manage me. She paused. That sounds like the minimum standard for a functional adult relationship. I understand how it sounds. But after 8 years of being managed very skillfully, the minimum standard felt like it still sometimes feels like an enormous thing. Sonia nodded. Didn't write anything down. That's off the record, she said. I know, Alina said. Thank you for asking. The day Ronan came back from San Francisco was a Saturday, late, as he'd said his flight was delayed, and he landed closer to midnight than to the late evening he'd promised. And Alina was awake when he texted to say he was in a cab from JFK, not because she'd been waiting up, but because she was finishing a site assessment report that had gotten complicated and the hours had slipped. She thought about going over. She thought about leaving it until Sunday morning, which would have been the sensible thing, the thing that didn't require driving or subwaying across the city at midnight on a cold March night. She got a cab. She didn't text him she was coming. She called when she was 5 minutes away, because showing up unexpected at someone's door past midnight was either very romantic or very alarming, depending on the relationship and the person, and she wanted him to have a moment to be awake and prepared and not caught at a disadvantage. He picked up on the second ring. Hey, I'm in a cab. I'm 5 minutes from your building. Is that? Yeah, he said, without hesitation, without the slightly too warm quality that would have meant he was performing welcome. I'll be downstairs. He was, when the cab pulled up standing on the sidewalk in front of his building in jeans and a sweater with a carry-on beside him, and the slightly displaced look of someone who had been in transit for several hours. The South Boston cold he'd grown up with, apparently still resident in him, enough that a March midnight didn't require a coat. He looked tired in the honest way, and she got out of the cab, and he looked at her, and there was a moment where neither of them said anything, and then she hugged him, which was not the most graceful thing she had ever done, because she misjudged the angle slightly, and they had a brief collision before it resolved into an actual embrace. And he laughed, really laughed. Not the small contained version, and she felt the laugh through his chest against hers. Missed you, she said into the sweater. She felt his arms close around her properly. Yeah, he said, me too. They went upstairs. He made tea because there was nothing in the apartment that qualified as food after a week away, and they sat on his couch with the city doing its late Saturday night version of itself outside the tall windows. And she told him about the meeting with Sonia Park. He listened. He asked one question, whether she felt good about what she'd shared, and she said yes, genuinely, not because it had been cathartic in any dramatic sense, but because it had felt like an accurate accounting, like saying a true thing in a clear voice without either softening it or amplifying it. He accepted that and moved on. I want to tell you something, he said, after a pause that felt deliberate. She looked at him. He was holding his teacup with both hands, looking at the window, the city light rendering his profile in its familiar sharp edges. Okay, the North Star board has been discussing an acquisition. Another company wants to buy in significant capital, institutional money. If it goes through, it changes my day-to-day. More public-facing. More events. More he paused. More rooms like the gala. More rooms like Raymond's engagement party. He said it without apology, but also without casual ease, with the seriousness of a man presenting a real thing to someone whose response mattered to him. I wanted you to know that before it happens rather than after. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this like it's a warning? He glanced at her sideways. Because it changes things. My visibility, my schedule. He stopped, reconsidered. The kind of life that becomes attached to me, in a practical sense. I've spent a long time deliberately keeping it low profile. If this goes through, that changes somewhat. I wanted to make sure you knew what you were, that you'd seen the actual picture before anything further. Ronan, she said. He stopped. I know who you are, she said. I knew who you were when I thought you were a moderately successful tech investor who rode a Harley and made pasta from scratch. I know who you are now. The acquisition doesn't change either of those. She paused. I'm not here because of what you have. If you need that stated plainly, I'll state it as many times as you need. He was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across his face, the complicated something she'd been watching for months, the one she was still in the process of naming. I know, he said, I know that. He paused again. He stopped, tried again, and she could see the effort, the reaching past the habits of a man who had spent most of his life making decisions alone and was still learning what it meant to share the architecture of them. I have a specific fear that I'm aware of and not entirely past, that the things I've built are more interesting to people than I am. That at a certain point, the money becomes the thing in the room, and the person behind it becomes a vehicle for it. She understood this. She understood it with the specific clarity of someone who had experienced the inverse being with a person for whom she had functioned as a vehicle. She reached over and set her hand on his arm. Not elaborate. Just contact. You're the most interesting thing in every room you're in, she said. That's not flattery. It's an observable fact that most of the room doesn't pick up on because you're not performing. He looked at her. The window behind him held the city in its late-night scatter. Dara, she said quietly. The woman who thought she owned the outcome because she'd witnessed the process. Yes, she hurt you more than you've said, yes. He said it simply, without drama and without deflection. She did. He was quiet for a moment. She told me at the end that she was the only person who'd ever really wanted me before I was worth anything. That everyone who came after was responding to the money. The success, he paused. She was trying to wound me. It worked. Not because it was entirely wrong, but because it wasn't entirely wrong. It's not entirely wrong that people respond differently to success, Alina said carefully. But it's also not the whole truth. And weaponizing the partial truth of it, using the fear that you might not be lovable without your accomplishments as a way to hold you in place, that's its own kind of thing. He looked at her steadily. I know, he said. I've known that for a while, rationally. The knowing and the... He stopped. The knowing and the body understanding are different timelines. They are, she said. I know something about that. They sat in the quiet of the apartment for a while. The tea went cold again. Outside, the city ran its late-night operations, the service vehicles, the clusters of people leaving restaurants, a lone cyclist going north against the light. The ordinary machinery of the place, indifferent and constant, and somehow comforting in its continuity. The art event is still Sunday, she said eventually. Yes, I'm looking forward to it. He nodded, set down his cold tea. Me too. A pause. No chandeliers. Definitely no chandeliers. No Gerald Raymond. No Gerald Raymond. No, he stopped. Something in his expression shifted into something she recognized as close to genuine amusement. No Prentice Holt. She laughed fully. The late hour and the cold tea and the weeks of accumulated tension behind them, making the laugh looser than it might have been otherwise. He watched her laugh with an expression she finally, sitting there past midnight in his Tribeca apartment, understood how to name. It was the expression of a man who had not expected this. Not the specific situation, not the woman, not the apartment, not the late-night arrival by cab from across the city, not the laughing, but the whole of it. The sense that the life he was living had turned out to contain something he had stopped believing was possible, not love exactly, or not only love, but the particular arrangement of two people who had both been through difficult things and come out the other side without becoming closed, who still had their full capacity for the ordinary warmth of existing in close proximity to someone they cared about. He had not expected this, and he was still slightly surprised by it, and he was trying very hard not to ruin it by being too careful around it. She understood all of that. She had her own version of the same internal territory. I should let you sleep, she said, though she made no move to get up. You don't have to go. I know, she didn't move. The city moved outside. I'm going to stay, he nodded. Simple. No performance around it, no warmth manufactured for the moment. Just a man who was glad she was staying, receiving that plainly. She texted her building's doorman to hold any packages until Monday. She texted Diana, staying in Tribeca. Diana sent back 3 words, finally. Good Lord, which Alina did not read until the following morning. She slept well for the first time in several weeks. She didn't examine why. Some things were better received without immediate analysis. Ronan's phone rang at 7 the following morning. He was already half awake. He didn't sleep late as a rule. Some combination of early riser habit and the residual vigilance of a man who had learned to come to full alertness quickly, and he answered it in the kitchen, quietly, while Alina was still most of the way asleep in the gray March morning coming through the windows. She heard his voice, low and even, the specific register he used for professional calls, and she heard the change in it partway through a slight recalibration, the sound of information arriving that required processing. She didn't hear the words. She was aware enough to register that something was shifting on the other end of the phone, and then she was asleep again. And when she woke fully an hour later, he was standing in the kitchen doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had received news and was deciding how to present it. Tell me, she said, sitting up. She accepted the coffee he handed her. He sat down on the edge of the bed. Something in his posture was different, not tense, but settled, the way he settled when the situation had clarified and he was prepared to handle it. That was someone from my legal team, cross-referencing with a contact at the SEC. He paused. Varela Capital has been issued a formal enforcement order. It's not public yet, it will be by Monday. The investigation's scope expanded in the last week. It's not just the reporting anomalies. They've documented what appears to be material misrepresentation to investors over a 3-year period. Alina held her coffee cup. How serious? Serious enough that his attorneys are in conversation about terms. Serious enough that the firm is almost certainly finished as an operating entity, regardless of personal criminal exposure. He paused. Serious enough that he's not going to be able to build his way back from this through charm and credential. She sat with that for a moment. The apartment was quiet around them. Morning light was doing its tentative early spring thing through the windows. He called me for money, she said. Ronan looked at her. When he called the call I told you about. He didn't say it directly. He said he needed me to speak to Celeste. But underneath that, the thing he was circling, he needed money. Capital. Someone who might bridge him through whatever was coming. She paused. I didn't fully register it at the time. I do now. He wouldn't have come to you for money unless his options were significantly contracted, Ronan said. The fact that he called you means the men he expected to call weren't answering. She drank her coffee. The city was waking up outside the Sunday morning version, slower and quieter than the weekday, the city at its most nearly human. He really thought I would, she said. Not bitterly. Just accurately. Not just help him with Celeste. He thought if he got to me, if he deployed enough history guilt, the vocabulary of what we were to each other, I would find a way to help him. He misjudged what leaving him had made you. He couldn't imagine leaving him could make me stronger, she said. That's the fundamental thing he got wrong. He thought leaving was a trauma I was recovering from. That I was smaller afterward. She paused. I'm not. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. The morning light moved between them. No, he said. You're not. She finished her coffee. Set the cup on the nightstand. I want to go see him, she said. He didn't react immediately. He processed it the way he processed most things genuinely, without the reflexive response that would have come from a man who led with ego. What do you mean by that? Not today. Not this week. But at some point when this is resolved into whatever it's going to be, I want to see him. Not to help him. Not to perform anything. Just she searched for it. I was married to him for 8 years. I am not his victim. I refuse that framing entirely. I made choices inside that marriage, and I made the choice to leave, and I'm responsible for all of it. But he was a real person to me for a long time. And whatever he's done and whatever is coming for him, I don't want to carry. I don't want the last thing between us to be a phone call where I told him he'd lost access to me. Ronan was quiet. That's different from helping him, she said. I know it doesn't sound confused, he said. It sounds like you. He paused. You carry more generosity than is strictly rational given the circumstances. Is that a problem? He looked at her. Something in his expression was careful and entirely without judgment. No, he said, it's one of the things He stopped. Started again, in the precise way he chose words when the thing he was reaching for mattered. It's one of the things I most respect about you. Your capacity for that, given everything. She looked at him sitting on the edge of his bed in the Sunday morning light, a man who had been through his own specific difficult things and arrived at 41 carrying them honestly. Not as baggage and not as armor, but simply as the true history of himself, available on request but not on display. She thought about what he'd said the night before, the fear that his accomplishments were more interesting than he was. The residual damage of a woman who had tried to use that fear as a cage. Ronan, she said. He looked at her. You know what I said at the gala? When Marcus asked if you could give me what he couldn't. You said I already had. Yes, she held his gaze. I want to tell you what I meant by that. Because I think I meant it more specifically than it sounded. He waited. He couldn't let me be more than the version of me that was useful to him, she said. He couldn't hold space for me exceeding what he'd planned for me. When I did, he found ways to bring me back down to a manageable size. And I let him for a long time because I thought that was what love required, fitting into the shape someone needed you to be. She paused. You don't do that. You've never once. She stopped. You let me be exactly as big as I actually am. That's what you've given me that he couldn't. Something in Ronan's face shifted with the specific quality of a man who has received something he hadn't expected to receive and is absorbing it without moving. He reached out and took her hand. Not briefly, this time he held it. Looked at it for a moment with the downturned attention of a man giving something that mattered his full acknowledgement. Thank you for telling me that, he said. You're welcome, she said. Outside, the Sunday city moved on in its quiet way. The morning was getting brighter. They had an art event in Williamsburg in the afternoon, and nowhere specific to be before it, and the day opened in front of them, with its ordinary, unhurried width. She did not need saving. She had not needed saving for a long time, maybe longer than she'd known. But it remained something to sit in the light of a Sunday morning beside a man who understood that and stayed anyway, and held her hand in the unhurried way of someone who wasn't going anywhere. The Williamsburg art event was held in a converted warehouse 2 blocks from the waterfront, the kind of space that had been a textile factory in another era and was now doing its best work as something else: entirely exposed brick, concrete floors, ceiling joists painted black, the whole industrial skeleton of the building left visible and celebrated rather than hidden behind drywall and recessed lighting. Someone had strung bare bulbs across the ceiling in loose, irregular lines that gave the light a warmth that no chandelier in any ballroom Alina had attended in the past 4 months had managed to produce. There were maybe 120 people. No dress code. No chandeliers, as promised. No Prentice Holt. Ronan wore jeans and a dark Henley and his leather jacket, which she had not seen on him since the Arts Foundation gala in December, when he'd worn it over his suit like a statement of something, and which on a Sunday afternoon in a Williamsburg warehouse was simply what he'd chosen to wear because it was cold and he owned it, and he didn't assign clothing more significance than it deserved. She wore a sweater the color of burnt amber and her good boots and her hair loose, and they walked through the space together with the easy, unhurried quality of 2 people who had been somewhere difficult and come out into ordinary daylight on the other side. The art was good. Not all of it, some of it was earnest in the way that young artists are earnest, reaching for profundity before they fully develop the technique to carry it, but several of the pieces stopped her in the genuine way that good work stops you, the way that made her stand in front of a large mixed media piece for several minutes without speaking, while Ronan stood beside her and also didn't speak, both of them giving the work the silence it earned. The piece was a city. Not a representational city, not New York rendered faithfully, but the emotional architecture of a city. Layers of material built up over a surface 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, translucent sheets of something that caught the bare bulb light differently at different depths, so that the works seemed to contain its own interior illumination. At the center of it, just slightly off-center, in a way that was clearly deliberate, there was a space that was entirely empty. Not a gap or an error, an intentional void, framed by the surrounding density in a way that made the emptiness structural. Made it part of what held everything else up. It's about what isn't there, Alina said. Ronan looked at the piece. The space does more work than the material around it. Yes, she studied the empty center. That's a very hard thing to make. Most people fill the space. They think filling it is the work. The discipline of leaving it empty, he said. Yes, knowing when the absence is the point. She tilted her head slightly. This person's going to be something. She found the artist's name on the small card beside the piece. Nia Torres, 23, from the Bronx, a former participant in one of the youth programs the Arts Foundation supported. One of the kids who had been in a program that someone she thought now of, Ronan, standing by the window at the December gala, speaking with the older man nobody else was watching, might have helped stay funded. She stood with that for a moment. The connections between things were rarely visible while they were being made. They only became apparent later, from a certain distance, when you could see the thread running between a quiet conversation at a party and a 23-year-old girl from the Bronx making work that stopped people in their tracks. She didn't say this to Ronan. It would have embarrassed him in a way he didn't deserve. She just stood there with the knowledge of it and let it settle somewhere quiet in her. They bought the piece. It was not expensive by any standard. She and Ronan operated in now $600, which was serious money for Nia Torres and less than the cost of a dinner in most of the rooms they'd occupied this winter. They didn't discuss it. She'd started to say she wanted to buy it, and he'd already been reaching for his card, and they'd had a brief wordless negotiation that resolved with her buying it because it was her instinct, and he understood that and stepped back. It would be ready for pickup in 2 weeks. They walked to the waterfront afterward because it was afternoon and still light, and the East River was doing its thing in the March cold gray-green and moving and entirely indifferent to human drama, which was one of the things Alina had always loved about rivers. They stood at the railing with coffee from a cart nearby and looked across at Manhattan, the familiar skyline rendered in the flat afternoon light into something almost modest, the buildings stripped of their nighttime glamour and just standing there being buildings. "I want to tell you something," she said. He turned slightly. "Listening. I applied for a commission last fall, before the Long Island City project resolved itself, before a lot of things resolved themselves. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. A public school redesign project in the South Bronx. 7 buildings, phased renovation, a significant public contract, the kind of work that defines a studio's trajectory for years. She paused. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to, I don't know. Build it into something before it was anything. Did you get it? She turned and looked at him. Something in her expression gave it away before she said it, and she watched him read it, and something shifted in his face. I got the notification Friday morning. I was going to tell you Friday night, but then you texted that your flight was delayed, and I wanted to tell you in person. He looked at her for a moment. Alina, 7 buildings, she said. 3 years of work, minimum. The kind of project that she stopped because her throat had done something unexpected, some tightening that she hadn't anticipated and didn't entirely have language for. Not sadness. The opposite of sadness. The feeling that sometimes visited when something you had worked very hard for finally arrived, and the work of it became suddenly visible, like the exertion of climbing a long hill, revealing itself all at once when you reached the top and turned around. It's the biggest thing I've ever been awarded, and I got it as me. As Alina Marquez Architectural Studio, no other name attached, no one's connection leveraged, no one's relationships. Your work, he said, my work, she said it quietly. Not triumphantly, not performed. Just the plain, factual statement of it. My work got me this. He put his arm around her, which he did rarely and deliberately, and she leaned into it without making a thing of it. The two of them, standing at the railing, looking at Manhattan across the water. The skyline she'd been looking at from different angles her entire adult life, suddenly containing the building she was going to design. Somewhere in the Bronx, 7 schools that she was going to rebuild into something children could learn and grow inside of. I'm proud of you, he said. Simple as that, no elaboration, no performance of enthusiasm. Just the sentence, direct and complete. Thank you, she said. I mean it. Not as he paused, not as the person who's with you. As someone who has watched you work, who has seen the hours of it and the difficulty of it and what you put into that Long Island City design when it wasn't cooperating. He looked at her. You earned this. She felt it land fully, without deflection. She had been working on receiving things without immediately redirecting them, without the reflexive minimizing that 8 years of being managed had installed in her, the habit of making herself smaller in the receiving of acknowledgement, because being seen too clearly had, for a long time, felt dangerous. She received it. She let it be what it was. They stood at the railing until the cold got serious, and then they walked back to find dinner, and the evening was ordinary in the specific way that the best evenings are ordinary. No drama, no performance, just 2 people who had navigated something difficult together and found themselves on the other side of it, in possession of a Sunday evening and somewhere to be. Sonia Park's piece ran on a Thursday in April. It was long, 6,000 words, exhaustively reported, the product of 4 months of investigation that had grown beyond the initial scope as the Varela capital enforcement story developed. It traced the pattern from the beginning, the early years of the firm, the point at which the performance reporting had begun to diverge from reality, the systematic management of investor perception that had run parallel to a personal style of operation that several former employees, all quoted anonymously, described in terms that Alina recognized with the uncomfortable intimacy of someone reading a description of weather they had lived through. Celeste was quoted by name. She had chosen to go on record, her attorney confirmed in a brief statement, because she believed that accountability required specificity and she was in a position to provide it. What she said was careful and precise and damaging in the way that careful, precise truth is damaging to people who have built their operations on managing other people's perceptions of it. Alina was not quoted. She appeared in the piece as a former long-term partner who spoke on background, one line, which was how she had asked for it. She was not identified. She had not gone on record and had not wanted to, and Sonia had honored that completely. She read the piece at her drafting table on a Thursday morning, with her coffee getting cold beside her, reading it the way you read something that contains your own history carefully, checking each sentence against her own memory of the same territory, finding the piece accurate in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable and always honest. When she finished, she sat for a while. Then she texted Diana. The Park piece ran. Diana texted back within 4 minutes. I read it. You okay? She thought about the question. She did the inventory. She was okay. She was more than okay. She was sitting in her own studio, which she had rebuilt from the ground up after leaving, surrounded by the physical evidence of work that was entirely hers, the Long Island City blueprints on the wall, the Bronx School project documents spread across the secondary table, the framed print of Naya Torres's piece that she'd picked up 2 weeks ago and hung on the wall across from her drafting table where she could see it while she worked. The deliberate void at its center doing the structural work that only absence can do. She texted Diana back, yes, genuinely. She called Ronan. He picked up on the third ring, sounding like he was mid-something, which he usually was in the morning. Saw it, he said before she'd gotten to it. It's accurate, she said. Yes, it's fair. Which is different from being kind, but Sonia was she did it right. She did, he agreed, a pause. How do you feel? Like it's over, she said. Not dramatically as a plain statement of what was true. Not because of the piece. She paused. I don't know exactly. Because this morning I woke up and made coffee and came into my studio and looked at the Bronx project and the thing that used to be underneath everything, the low-frequency thing, the awareness of Marcus's existence in the world as something that involved me, somehow it's gone. It was already going. But this morning it's gone. Ronan was quiet for a moment. She heard him move the shift of a chair, the sound of his office settling around him. Good, he said. That's it? Good? What else is there to say? He paused, and she could hear the dry warmth in it. You got free. You built something. Someone tried to make you smaller, and you got larger instead. That's the whole story. Good seems accurate. She looked at Nia Torres's piece across the room. The deliberate empty center, the surrounding density that made the absence structural, necessary, the thing that held everything up. Good, she agreed. She saw Marcus once more, and only once, and it was not under any of the circumstances she had imagined when she'd told Ronan she wanted to see him. No arranged meeting, no careful conversation in a neutral space. It happened the way certain things happen sideways, without ceremony on an ordinary Tuesday in early May. She was coming out of a planning meeting at the city offices in Lower Manhattan, a preliminary session for the Bronx School project with the city's facilities management team. 2 hours of the careful bureaucratic work that large public projects required before anyone was allowed to put a pencil to actual design. She was feeling good the way she felt after productive meetings with people who took the work seriously, who asked real questions and expected real answers. She was on the sidewalk outside the building, adjusting the strap of her bag, when she saw him. He was half a block away, coming the other direction. He looked smaller. Not literally, he was the same height, the same physical presence, but the quality of him had changed in the way that certain people change when the thing they were performing has been publicly withdrawn. He was wearing a coat that she recognized from 2 winters ago, which was not significant in itself but was notable because Marcus had always replaced things seasonally, had always had the newest version of everything, and the fact of the old coat said something about the last 2 months that no financial column could say more precisely. He saw her in the same moment she saw him. They were too close to pretend otherwise. The urban math of it didn't allow for the dignified non-encounter. They were 30 feet apart and facing each other, and there was no version of the next 10 seconds where they didn't acknowledge each other. She stopped. He stopped. And then, because she had said she wanted to see him and meant it in a specific way that she had spent several weeks being honest with herself about, she closed the distance and stopped 2 feet in front of him. On the sidewalk outside a city building in the May morning, ordinary life moving around them on all sides. Marcus, she said, Alina. His voice had lost its management quality. That was the first thing she noticed. The voice she was hearing was the least performed version she had ever encountered, the version that existed underneath all the layers of careful calibration. It was exhausted and older than she remembered and not unrecognizable. It was the voice of the man she had married, before she understood what the marriage actually was. I wasn't expecting to see you. I know. She looked at him. Really looked. Not the quick assessment of someone cataloging a threat, but the full attention of someone trying to see another person accurately. He was tired in a deep structure way. He had lost weight that he hadn't needed to lose. There were circles under his eyes that were not the temporary kind. How are you doing? He looked at her. The question landed with a precision she hadn't entirely intended, not cruelly, not sarcastically. She meant it genuinely. But the genuineness of it was somehow more disorienting for him than anything barbed would have been. A pause. Then, with what she recognized as the closest thing to honest she had probably ever heard from him. Not well. I'm sorry to hear that, she said. And she was. Not sorry in the way that involved regret for anything she had done or undone, not sorry in the way that meant she wished his consequences away, but sorry in the plain human sense of the word, the version that acknowledges that watching another person in pain is not comfortable, regardless of the choices that created the pain. He looked away, looked back, the firm as he stopped. You know, you've read it. Yes. There are personal charges being considered. Not just civil. My attorneys, he stopped again, pressed his mouth closed for a moment. I'm not going to burden you with the details. I know I don't have any right to do that. He paused. I know I tried to, on the phone. I'm sorry for that. She absorbed the apology. She didn't perform receiving it. She just let it be what it was. Okay, she said. I want you to know. He stopped, started again. There was something visibly difficult about this for him, the reaching past the performed self, and she watched him do it with the mixture of feeling she had discovered over the past months was simply what she felt about Marcus Varela, something complicated and old and no longer central to anything. I want you to know that what you said on the phone, about the word paranoid, he met her eyes. I knew what I was doing when I used that word. Not just with you, with Celeste, with people at the firm. I knew it made people doubt themselves, and I used it deliberately. I needed you to know that I know that I'm not. He stopped. I'm not going to pretend it was unconscious. She looked at him for a long moment. The acknowledgement was not nothing. She had not expected it, and it was not nothing. Thank you for saying that, she said. She meant it. It doesn't fix anything. No, but it's true. That matters. He nodded, looked at his shoes briefly, then back at her. The May morning moved around them. You look like yourself, he said. More than when we were together. Which I understand is, he stopped. I understand what that means. Yes, she said simply. They stood there for another moment. Two people on a sidewalk in Lower Manhattan with 8 years between them and no functional relationship left of any kind. In the brief, strange grace of having said the thing that needed to be said without catastrophe or performance. I have to go, she said. I know. He stepped back, giving her the sidewalk, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. Alina, she looked at him. I hope I mean that. Whatever comes after this. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the invisible wreckage surrounding him. I hope you keep whatever this is. Another vague gesture, this one toward her. Whatever you found. Thank you, Marcus, she said. She meant that too. She walked away. She didn't look back. Not because she was being deliberate about not looking back, not as a statement, but simply because the forward direction was more interesting than the backward one. She had somewhere to be. In late May, Ronan left for a week in London. The acquisition discussions that had been building since January had reached a stage that required his physical presence, the kind of negotiations that video calls couldn't close because the trust required for very large sums of money still, at a certain level, required being in the same room with someone. He flew out on a Monday and came back the following Sunday, and in the interim, Alina finished the preliminary concept package for the first phase of the Bronx School project, which required 3 consecutive 16-hour days and 2 nights where she slept on the small couch in her studio and woke up with the particular stiffness of someone who had let the work take everything. Temporarily, because she trusted it to give something back. It gave something back. The concept package was the best early-stage work she had ever produced. She knew it the way you know certain things, not through external validation, but through the internal sense of having reached for something and found that she'd gotten there. The buildings in her drawings were not just functional renovations. They were spaces designed around a fundamental question: what does a child need from a room to believe that what happens inside it matters? The answer she had arrived at was light, scale that wasn't intimidating, and the structural dignity of a building that had been built to take a person seriously. She thought, looking at the drawings late on the 3rd night with her cold coffee and the city quiet outside, about Nia Torres in the Bronx, learning that her city had given her a building that was worth something. About the unknown kids who would eventually sit in these schools and register below the level of conscious thought. That someone had cared about the proportions of the windows and the height of the ceilings and the way the light fell at 3 in the afternoon. That was the invisible work. Most of the important work was invisible. Ronan came back on a Sunday afternoon and she was at her apartment, the concept package finished and sent, and the particular exhaustion of completion sitting on her like a second skin. When she heard his key in her lock, she had given him a key 2 months ago, without ceremony, simply pressing it into his hand one morning, and saying for when it's useful, and neither of them making it more than what it was. He came in with his bag, and she was on the couch with her feet up and a cup of actual hot tea for once, and he dropped his bag, sat down on the coffee table facing her, and looked at her with the assessment of a man checking the actual condition of someone he cared about. "You worked yourself to the floor," he said. "The concept package is done. I can see that on your face." He reached over and took her tea, looked at it, determined it was still hot, handed it back to her. "When did you last eat a full meal?" She thought about it. Yesterday, probably. Yesterday, probably. It was a critical week. It was. He stood, went to the kitchen, opened her refrigerator with the expression of someone who had expected to find it inadequate and found it more so. He ordered food from his phone. She heard him doing it. The brief conversation, the address given, and then came back and sat down beside her rather than across from her. "Tell me about it. All of it. The week." So she told him. She told him about the 3 days of concentrated work, about the moment on the second night where the central design concept had crystallized from something she'd been circling to something she could hold clearly, about finding herself thinking about Naya Torres's piece, The Deliberate Empty Center, the void that did structural work, and understanding that the principle translated to educational space, that what children needed from rooms was not fullness, but the kind of considered openness that tells a person their presence is anticipated and valued. He listened. He asked the questions that told her he was genuinely following, not conversational questions, not supportive noises, but the specific questions of someone who was interested in the actual architecture, the actual thinking. He had always been like this. She had noticed from early in their relationship when she talked about her work. He listened as though it mattered, not because he was performing the role of supportive partner, but because it genuinely interested him. The way that serious work, any serious work, was interesting to a person who had done serious work themselves. The food arrived. They ate on her couch, takeout containers spread on the coffee table, the May evening doing its thing through the open window warm for once, the city releasing the last of winter with the reluctant relief of something that had been clenched for a long time. The London meetings, she said, when she'd eaten enough to feel functional again. How did they go? Well, he was quiet for a moment. The acquisition is moving forward. The terms are favorable. It's going to be a significant change to the company's structure and to mine. He looked at her sideways. "I told you about this in March, that it would change things. I remember. It's real now. It's not hypothetical." He paused. "More visibility, more presence required in certain contexts. The kind of rooms I've spent 15 years avoiding because they required performing a version of myself I didn't want to be." "Will you have to?" she asked. "Perform?" He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than dismissing it. "Some. Less than I feared. The acquisition structure gives me more control over my own involvement than I expected. The new partners are..." He paused. "They're serious people. They care about the work more than the performance of the work, which is what I needed before I'd agree to it." "That sounds like you drove a hard negotiation." "I did," he said without modesty. "I know what I'm worth, and I know what I need to function. I stopped apologizing for either a long time ago." She looked at him. The kitchen light fell across him in the easy way of a Sunday evening jacket off, the tiredness of a transatlantic week on him but worn lightly, the specific solidity of a man who had come home and found that home was where he'd left it. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at her with the expression that appeared when she asked him a direct question that most people didn't ask, the expression that preceded genuine consideration rather than reflexive response. "I'm not, I don't know if happy is the right word." He paused. "I'm satisfied. I'm present. He looked at his hands, then at her. "I'm in a life that I built and I believe in, with a person I chose and who chooses me back. That's not nothing. That's actually," he paused again. "That's more than I expected to be able to say." She felt the weight of that. The specific, honest weight of a man not overstating things, because overstating was a form of performance and he had run out of energy for performance a long time ago. "That's more than most people can say," she said. "Yes." She reached over and took his hand. They sat like that for a while. The takeout containers and the May evening and the city they both lived in, and neither of them owned, doing the quiet, unspectacular work of two people present in the same space, choosing each other in the ordinary, daily way that people choose each other when the choosing is real. The Harley came out in June. She had not seen it since December, the night of the Arts Foundation Gala, when she'd noticed it parked outside his building, the black Triumph he kept for exactly this kind of weather. the motorcycle equivalent of the decision to step outside when a room became too loud. She had asked him about it once, and he had said that riding was the only thing he'd found that put his mind in a particular kind of quiet, not silence exactly, but the focused single-pointedness that came from being required to be completely present for a continuous physical task, with the consequence of distraction being serious enough to prevent the mind from wandering. She understood this. Architecture did something similar for her. The moments of deep design work were the moments when everything else went silent, not because the problems went away, but because they temporarily stopped mattering more than the problem directly in front of her. The first Saturday in June, he came to pick her up on the Harley. She had known it was coming. He'd mentioned it the week before, asked if she'd ridden. She'd said once, a long time ago. He'd said that was enough. She'd been honest about the brief flicker of nerves when she'd thought about it, and he'd said, without drama, that they could take his car if she preferred, and she would have lost respect for herself if she'd said yes. She had not said yes. The morning was what early June in New York sometimes managed to be genuinely warm, clear. The city in the brief window between the last of spring and the onset of summer's heavy heat. She came outside to find him at the curb, the Harley's engine running with a sound that was felt in the chest as much as heard, and he was in jeans and a jacket, and he looked like the man she had first noticed, standing beside her at the Arts Foundation gala, the man who wore leather over his suit and had cold, steady eyes, and made her feel immediately that here was a person who was not performing anything. She put on the helmet he handed her. He checked at the fit without comment, the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and considered safety a practical matter rather than a romantic one. Comfortable, he asked. Ask me in 20 minutes, she said. He almost smiled. Got on. She got on behind him and put her arms around him, and then the bike moved into the Saturday morning streets of New York, and she understood within a block what he had meant about the mind going quiet. There was nothing to do but be there. The city opened around them, not the city as backdrop, not the city as viewed from a cab or a window, but the city as immediate physical fact, the air against her face and the sound and the texture of it. The particular choreography of a motorcycle in Manhattan traffic, where you were simultaneously more vulnerable than anything around you and more precisely aware of it. She held on. She watched the streets go by. She did not think about the Bronx Project or the London acquisition or Sanja Park's piece or anything that had happened in the last 6 months. She simply went. They rode north through the park, out the other side, down through Harlem, across the bridge, back through Brooklyn in a loop that took 45 minutes and covered enough of the city that she felt she'd been somewhere complete. By the time they stopped, parked outside a coffee place in Dumbo that he apparently knew, she had the slightly blown open feeling of a person who had briefly exceeded their usual perimeter. They sat outside with coffee and the view of the bridge and the Manhattan skyline across the water, which was different from the waterfront in Williamsburg in a way she'd have to think about to fully articulate the bridge itself. Maybe the specific scale of it, the fact of something so enormous built to hold a connection. Well, he said, that was... She searched for the honest version. That was very loud and very fast. I was scared for about the first 3 minutes, and then I wasn't. What changed at 3 minutes? I realized you were completely competent, and I was completely present, and there was nothing else required. He looked at his coffee cup. That's the thing about it. I understand now, she said, the quiet in the middle of the noise. He nodded. They drank their coffee. The bridge held its enormous, improbable connection between the two shores, and had been holding it for over 100 years, which was a fact she knew professionally and suddenly felt differently about, sitting under it. There were things you had to be built correctly to hold. Weight, tension, the constant small pressures of weather and use and time. If you were built correctly, you held. If you were built with compromises hidden in the structure, you held until the compromises accumulated past a threshold, and then you didn't. Marcus had been built with hidden compromises. The investigation, the charges being considered, the collapsed firm, the ended engagement, these were not punishments handed down from some external moral authority. They were the structure revealing what had always been inside it. The compromises accumulated past their threshold. She had been built differently. Not without flaws, she knew her flaws with an honesty she had worked for. In therapy, in the studio, in the difficult quiet of her own company during the long year of rebuilding. She was impatient sometimes. She was too slow to ask for help when she needed it. She had spent years allowing someone to manage her perceptions because part of her had believed she was not quite trustworthy enough to be her own authority. She was still working on that last one, but the structure held. That was what she knew now. Sitting under the bridge with her coffee on a June morning, the Harley parked at the curb, Ronan beside her with his own coffee and his own flaws and his own history, and no interest in pretending otherwise. The structure held because she had rebuilt it around true things rather than convenient ones. "I want to ask you something," she said. He looked at her. "The Bronx project is going to take at least 3 years, probably closer to 4, given the phase structure and the city's timeline." She paused. "My studio is going to grow. I'm going to need more people, a larger space, more of my attention going toward managing the thing and less toward the purely creative work, which is both a problem and a good problem." She paused again. "My life is going to look different in 3 years than it does now. I want to know if you're thinking about what your life looks like in 3 years." He looked at her steadily. "Is this a practical question or a relationship question?" "Both. I don't know how to separate them." He was quiet for a moment. The bridge held above them. The water moved below. The city did its Saturday thing on both shores. "The acquisition closes in September. After that, my role is by design more strategic and less operational. I will have more time and more flexibility than I've had in years." He paused. "I've been thinking about the Literacy Foundation in the Bronx. The building renovation I committed to funding. It's in the same district as your school project." A pause. "I was thinking about whether to get more directly involved. Not just the funding, but the oversight. Making sure the renovation actually serves the community it's supposed to serve, rather than the version of it that looks good in a press release." She looked at him. "You were thinking about spending more time in the Bronx." "I was thinking about spending more time in the Bronx," he confirmed. "Separately from anything to do with you, but not unrelated to knowing you." She understood what he meant by that. Not that she was the reason. That knowing her had made him think more carefully about what he wanted to put his time toward, which was a different and more honest thing. 3 years, she said. At least, he said. Probably more. She held her coffee cup in both hands. The morning moved around them. She thought about the woman who had walked into the Arts Foundation gala in December in a room she'd been dreading, expecting to survive an encounter with her past, and had instead found something she hadn't been looking for and had not known how to name until it had already changed her. She thought about everything that had happened in the months between then and this June morning, the engagement party, Celeste's call, the financial piece, the phone call from Marcus she had answered without fear, the Bronx Commission, the concept package, the sidewalk encounter, the Harley Nia Torres's piece on her studio wall with the deliberate void at its center doing the structural work. She thought about what it meant to build something correctly. "Okay," she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Okay, what?" "Okay to all of it." She looked at him. The 3 years. The Bronx. Whatever the next thing is after that. She paused. "I'm not trying to make a declaration. I'm trying to say I'm not afraid of the timeline. Whatever it is." He looked at her for a long moment. With that expression, she had finally learned to name the expression of a man who had stopped expecting things and found that what arrived without expectation was sometimes the truest version of anything. The expression of someone still mildly surprised by this and choosing to stay in that surprise rather than armor himself against it. "Neither am I," he said. They finished their coffee. They got back on the Harley. She put her arms around him, and the engine turned over, and the city opened ahead of them. In the June morning, all of it, the boroughs and the bridges, the school she was going to rebuild, the children who would sit in rooms designed to take them seriously, the ordinary, complex life she had built from the wreckage of the one that hadn't held. She held on, not because she was afraid, because she chose to. The Harley moved into the morning, and the city received them, indifferent and enormous, and full of the small human reckonings, happening in 10,000 separate rooms at once. People choosing, people building, people learning the difference between what someone told them they were worth and what they actually were. The work of a whole life, most of it invisible, most of it ongoing, almost none of it finished. That was fine. She had learned to work in that space. She had learned that the void at the center was not an absence to be filled, but a structure to be honored. And that the most important things were often the ones that couldn't be seen, the foundation beneath the building. The decision made in a quiet room that changed the direction of everything. The moment someone stopped believing what they'd been told about themselves and started building from what they knew was true. She had been underestimated. She had been managed. She had been reduced, slowly and skillfully, and then she had left, and then she had rebuilt. And here was what she knew. Holding on at 60 miles an hour through the Brooklyn streets in June, the rebuilding was never finished. And that was not a defeat. It was the whole point. You kept building. You built better each time, with better materials, toward something you'd learned to trust. You built toward the life you actually wanted, rather than the version of it that was easiest for someone else to manage. She had built this. All the way from the December gala to this June morning, all the choices in between the engagement party, the phone calls, the work, the conversations, the Bronx Commission, the quiet man beside her who let her be exactly as large as she was, all of it was hers. The city moved. The morning held. She tightened her arms slightly around him, not from fear but from the plain, unperformed choice of being exactly where she was and nowhere else, pa.